is that this forum models the kind of inclusive dialogue, the back and forth of talking and listening, and of engagement that is really at the heart of our enterprise at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Before we begin the day and hear from our first speaker, President Ron Daniels, I would like to go through a little bit of housekeeping, if I might. We are all here in the spirit of productive discourse, and to that end, each panel today will engage in a back and forth as a group with questions and conversations being led by our moderators. But there will be time at the end of each panel for our audience members, both here and our audience members online, this event is being live streamed, to ask questions via the URL that we've provided. So on the screens, you will find the URL where you can submit your questions. The moderators of the panels will have an iPad and they'll be able to see your questions so that they can ask the panel your questions. I just want to note that here at Johns Hopkins, we welcome all views, as any institution should and must do. And we also want to ensure that our guests and our participants and audience leave today feeling respected. I'm so pleased now to welcome to the stage Johns Hopkins University's 14th president, Ron Daniels.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning, and let me echo Elizabeth's welcome to all of you. Johns Hopkins is, of course, thrilled to be hosting this event with the Renewed Democracy Initiative, and so grateful to our partners at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for their support, including Nancy McKistry and Vasily Sanis, who are sitting in the front row and joining us today, as they have indeed for so many other events. Welcome to you both, and again, please convey our deep gratitude back to the foundation. And of course, thanks to the team at the Johns Hopkins SNF Agora Institute for their tireless efforts to make this event happen, especially the Institute's unflagging Executive Director, Elizabeth Smythe, and Project Manager, Carol Glagola. So I'm delighted to have everyone here at the Johns Hopkins Peabody Library. But I'd like to begin my remarks by taking you, for a moment at least, out of this cathedral of books and learning to Poland, February 1978. Professor Adam Michnik is delivering a lecture on Polish history to a rapt crowd of more than 100 students. He is not speaking in a spacious lecture hall, however, but in a small, cramped, private apartment. You see, Michnik was a professor in the Flying University, a nomadic clandestine institution of learning that operated periodically in Poland during times of political oppression and censorship. In this instance, it was born in response to the Communist Party's stranglehold on public universities, which the party achieved by eliminating entire disciplines for being too ideological, turning away students for their political beliefs, and selecting administrators who would toe the party line. Midway through Michnik's lecture, secret police burst through the door. Tear gas and beatings followed. Michnik was arrested, as he would be again and again, for teaching students the history that had been erased from the curriculum. Everything from the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to the food price riots just 2 years earlier in 1976. In short, Michnik was arrested for teaching truth in a regime sustained, nourished by deceit. The Flying University of the 1970s was disbanded in 1981 after Poland instituted martial law. But its brief career is a sobering reminder of how swiftly illiberal and authoritarian forces can endanger core institutions and the freedoms they were built to protect. And while we're fortunate to live in a country that does not need clandestine colleges to disseminate truth and combat falsehood, we must take heed, especially now when around the world once strong liberal democracies, including our own, are subject to backsliding at an alarming rate. Political scientist Larry Diamond, as you know, calls this the democracy recession, and it continues apace. The symptoms are all around us. We see it in the erosion of public discourse, in the diminishing integrity of free elections, in a media landscape where fake news reaches people on social media 6 times faster than real news, which confounds debate and corrodes standards of truth. And we see it in the rise of an entrenched and bitter partisan animosity, which has intensified to such a degree that 78% of Americans believe that even basic facts have a partisan bent. Such conditions cannot help but sow public confusion and amplify populist resentment. And when they do, they imperil free institutions, from the courts to the media to, of course, universities. Today's conference is a step towards confronting the causes and conditions of these challenges to liberal democracy and devising ways to address them. It is also a critical opportunity to model the mutual respect and productive discourse among divergent viewpoints that are so foundational to the democratic process. And indeed, there's no better place to do that work here than at Johns Hopkins in the magisterial Peabody Library. In the words of its founder and namesake, George Peabody, this place was built to be a reprieve from what he called the party rancor that proliferates in the outside world. It was to be a place open to all people to pursue the kinds of dialogue, to study that enrich and refine not only the individual, but indeed collective life. It represents the very best of what our universities have to offer democracy. Indeed, in the firmament of core democratic institutions, the university stands, I believe, as indispensable because it is a place apart. Now, by this, I don't mean that it is deaf to the exigencies of the present or disengaged from the communities of which it is part. Rather than I mean its commitments should and must extend beyond the politics of the moment. Universities must be places devoted to the dispassionate advancement of knowledge and understanding, to the exercise of reason, and to the marshaling of facts and evidence to assess competing claims to truth. They're communities that must be fueled by unfettered play of free intellect and by the power of dialogue and debate to enhance, to expand, and to test our ideas. The SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins seeks to embody these ideals. Founded with a gift from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, it is an institution devoted to tackling the problems afflicting liberal democracy through rigorous academic research, the practical applications of insights, and events such as this one. And whether here in Baltimore or in DC at our new home in the museum building, Johns Hopkins is determined to be at the heart of national dialogue and to bring our ideas to bear on the critical issues of the moment, as well as those to come. And with today's conversation, we will do just that as our panelists and presenters take up questions that are not only urgent and integral to our uncertain present, but also part of that larger conversation that extends deep into the past and will continue, we hope, long into the future. So with that, let me invite back to the stage the Executive Director of the SNF Agora Institute, Elizabeth Smythe, who in her work for this conference and this institution has truly invested all of herself in awakening the spirit of liberal democracy. We thank you for your leadership and again, turn the podium over to you. Elizabeth, thank you for being here today.
Okay, so one more bit of housekeeping that I forgot to share with you is we do have a lot of exciting panelists, as I mentioned, many of whom have books that they have written that are tackling the topics that they'll both be speaking about and others related to the themes of this conference. The Ivy Bookshop, our local bookseller here in Baltimore, has copies of those books. Most of them are signed for sale. So I would also encourage you to make sure to stop by there if you are interested in pursuing any of these ideas beyond what you hear on the stage today. So now I am pleased to welcome to the stage our first panel, an esteemed group of panelists who will be talking about populism and democracy. This panel will be moderated by Mark Laswell, who is the Associate Opinion Page Editor at The Washington Post, and last year spent some time at Johns Hopkins teaching writing to our students. Joining Mark will be Sherry Berman, Professor of Political Science at Barnard College and Columbia University. Bill Bill has the flu. Francisco Gonzalez, Associate Professor of International Political Economy and Latin American Politics at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS. And Yasha Monk, one of Agora's own and a professor of practice at SAIS as well. As a reminder, this panel, along with all of our discussions, is being put on in the spirit of inclusive engagement and discourse. So we will provide time at the end of the panel to take audience questions as well. The URL is on the screen, so you're going to get tired of me saying this. But in case someone new comes in the room, I will continue to do so. And now I would like to turn this panel over to Mark. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. The subject of this panel is populism and democracy. And first of all, I thought, let's define populism. It's a word that's thrown around a lot today, especially after the election of Donald Trump, but also it has its roots long before the arrival of Donald Trump. But now it appears in headlines and in newspaper stories, in op-eds for the Washington Post, as a sort of catch-all word that sometimes just seems to define, people use it to describe any political movement they don't like. But there are actual qualities of populism that I think we should try to define first before we move on to talk about how it impacts on democracy.
Okay.
So can you?
Of course. Good morning to everyone. Populism has been defined, obviously, in a variety of ways. Some people stress the social aspects of the mobilization of people. Some people highlight the economic aspect, about trying to make things better for the have-nots, a strong, active state government that is trying to level socioeconomic conditions. And others highlight more the political aspect. I'm one of those. I study Latin American politics. The region has a long history of populist rhetoric, populist movements, populist leaders. What is populism? It's a political strategy. It's a political strategy to try to gain and/or retain power by trying to segment society into two groups. It's us versus them. Us are the nasty small elites, the tycoons, the people who get away with all the privilege. And us, including the leader, are the have-nots, the people who desire, who need justice, and the leader is supposed to carry out this justice.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that that's a great place to start. I mean, I think perhaps the most distinctive feature of populism is exactly what Francisco said, which is this kind of assumption or assertion that there's a division between the people, however defined, and some other set of individuals who are somehow or another subverting the will of that people. Sometimes it's elites, economic elites, sometimes it's immigrants, sometimes it's minorities. Whatever it is, the idea inherent in this concept, I think, is that the people's will has somehow or another been thwarted. And so another aspect that I think is very much worth stressing is that populism tends to arise in political systems, democracies in particular, where there are a significant group of people who feel the system is not working for them. So it's very much a kind of reaction in some ways to a failure of representation, a failure of democracy to kind of deliver for a significant group of people. So I think we should think about it in conjunction with democracy as indicating, again, that there's something probably pretty wrong.
Mm-hmm. And Yasha, do you think that populism can come from the left and the right? Are they, do they have often the same grievances or just coming at it from a different direction?
Yeah, thank you for asking me a different question, because I feel like there's only so many definitions of populism people can take at 9 a.m. in the morning. But I think that's right. I mean, the thing that makes populism so dangerous is that it's not just people who say, hey, I speak for people a little bit better than the current government, I feel like the current government is making some mistakes. That's a completely ordinary part of democratic politics. It's the claim that I alone really stand for the people, and everybody who disagrees with me is therefore, in a real deep, important sense, illegitimate. And it's precisely that claim which otherwise strikingly different people on left and right have in common. That's what Donald Trump and Hugo Chavez had in common. That is what some of the left-wing populists in Italy in the Five-Star Movement and some of the right-wing populists in Italy in the League have in common. And it starts to show why populism is so uniquely dangerous. Because unlike, say, fascist competitors to democracy, they arise from within democracy and actually claim to be more democratic than anybody else. But if you don't accept that there's a legitimate opposition, if you think that a press that criticizes you shouldn't be allowed to reach a big audience, if you think that judges should actually do your bidding rather than try to protect the rule of law, then you're going to pretty quickly undermine the basic rules and norms of the political system. And you end up in a place, and we've seen that both with left-wing populists in Venezuela and with right-wing populists in places like Hungary, where democratically elected political leaders can no longer be displaced by democratic means.
And what is it about democracy and liberal democracy in particular that makes it vulnerable to sort of eruptions of populism? Is there something that's happened in the past decade that has nurtured that?
Liberal democracy, in fact, the original Roman democracy, which was not a democracy, was an oligarchy, is the cradle of populism, the birth of the factions of populares versus the elites. What the structure of having a forum, a public forum where common issues, ideas are debated, is amenable to it being structured into two. There might be many more. Many European democracies are multi-party coalition governments. In some, there are 5, 6 governments that parties that make up the government. But democracy since back then, and we're talking about 2nd century before Christ, does have as an inherent feature the possibility of structuring of grievances in a way that haves versus have-nots, insiders versus outsiders. Sherry mentioned immigrants versus the domestic elements, the highly cultured versus the unwashed. All those images are played time and time again, and it's much easier for them to find a voice within given institutions than in, say, authoritarian or totalitarian regimes where things are not clearly structured. At least they don't give a voice, a clear voice to different groups. Things tend to be much more controlled. They depend on a very few. Repression can happen out of the blue. Democracy, in a way, has a populist inherent capacity. And later on, if I may, I would, 9 a.m. Devil would say, it does not necessarily have to be terrible or dangerous. Later.
Sherry.
Yeah, so again, taking up on some of these points, I mean, opposition arises in all kinds of political regimes. So I think the distinctive thing about democracy, obviously, is that it is ostensibly, by its name, supposed to be ruled by the people. And so opposition within democracy can take on this populist flavor, again, because the assertion is that the people's will has been thwarted. Now, I think what Yasha said is very important, though. I mean, saying that the government is not responsive, that in and of itself is neither problematic nor necessarily populist. Saying that this thwarting or this ignoring of the people has gone so far as to bring into question whether the government or the opposition is legitimate, that is something that is both distinctive and dangerous. But I think the reason why you get these kinds of movements periodically erupting in democracy is because the entire, again, rationale of democracy is that the people are supposed to be responded to. They are supposed to be the ones who govern. And so, again, I think when significant numbers of people feel that democracy is not delivering on its promise, you tend to get opposition that takes this kind of form, which, again, can be very dangerous if it leads folks and the leaders of these movements to question whether or not those who are opposed to them should be able to participate in this system any further.
You know, as I've been listening to Shari and Francisco, I've been wondering whether we tend to get this question exactly the wrong way around, which is to say we're sort of amazed that populism is arising in democracies. But perhaps the real question is, how is it that democracies have historically been so incredibly stable? I mean, it is a very strange and unnatural thing that somebody who is the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has all of these things they could do to entrench their power, and they haven't done it. And so perhaps we should actually think about the sort of special things that made that possible. And one of those is that for most of the period of democratic stability, for most of the time in which democracies have had the kind of stability that we now take for granted, we've had a bunch of very special conditions. We were at a moment of great economic progress, which gave people this huge residual trust in the political class and an optimism about the future. We were in a moment in which global democracies were by far the richest and the most powerful countries in the world. We were at a moment in which, for all kinds of reasons, there was an unusual amount of solidarity between citizens. We were at a historical juncture in which the experience of the fascist threat and the reality and the danger of a communist threat were on the top of everybody's minds. And so perhaps rather than what we're going through right now being an extraordinary aberration from the tendencies which democracies have to descend into deep tribalism and winner-take-all politics, this is actually the natural state, and we should be thinking about how to struggle against this natural state in order to preserve these institutions in that context.
Did I detect a note of skepticism from Sherry?
Perhaps, I don't know.
Well,
you have to ask Sherry.
I mean, look, there's a lot of in what Yasha said, right, and a lot that's worth thinking about. I mean, the sort of post-war period was in many senses quite unusual, right? We had very high levels of growth in the West. We had incredible levels comparatively of social stability, partially as a result of that growth. And so there are a lot of folks who are now kind of questioning whether or not the stability that happened during the post-war period is an aberration or is something that can be recreated. I'm maybe a little bit less skeptical. I'm also a little less skeptical as to whether or not democracy has to absolutely be able to produce these, you know, sort of incredible results. I think it has inherent strengths that go beyond the particular performance that it has. And I think that we can see that in many parts of the world today, in places where people are upset with their leaders, Algeria most recently, yay, and Venezuela, where democracy becomes the kind of default option because people understand that, you know, as bad as democracy can be, it has some inherent advantages, not least of which is that you get an opportunity to change your leaders and your governments and hope for something better. So I'm less pessimistic, I think, perhaps, than Yasha is that democracy requires very particular kinds of economic conditions, although obviously those are very important. And I also think it's important for us not to be too pessimistic today, even though we are obviously facing a lot of problems. I don't think they're as bad as a lot of people think, and I also think that the pessimism in and of itself is quite dangerous in some ways.
So I don't know how much we disagree. It seems to me that the basic ideals of liberal democracy remain incredibly powerful. I mean, I think it's helpful to think about those for a moment. It's basically the aspiration that we should lead free lives as individuals, that we ourselves get to decide what kind of life we want to lead and the rule of law that we need in order to sustain that. And then the aspiration at the same time to sustain some kind of collective self-determination, where we collectively decide how to rule ourselves. And I do think that those ideals remain incredibly motivating, and that when people live in a dictatorship which collapses, that's what they sort of try to do. But that doesn't mean that those regimes are going to be stable. And so we may now be in a world in which countries which rebel against the dictator successfully try to establish a liberal democracy, but those liberal democracies often fail. And some of the countries in which we thought democracy would always be stable actually go through moments of seeing dictators rise through this new pathway of populists who claim that they're more democratic than anybody else, amassing more and more power. And then at some points there'll be another revolution, there'll be another attempt at democracy, but the whole thing may be much more unstable, much more zigzaggy than what we've known in the post-war period.
And Francisco, you've talked about the idea of the political entrepreneur in relation to populism, and I wondered if you could elaborate on that. Do you need a political entrepreneur to exploit sort of latent populism, or do they once the populist movement is swelling, then do they jump in front of the parade?
It can happen both ways. As my colleagues were mentioning, the arena that democracy creates by giving voice to people, by allowing them to vote every so often, by allowing them to, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom to produce inputs into the system, that in a way, on the one hand, might diffuse the possibility that many things remain there just latent and everyone has to act secretively underground because authority is looking at us. Democracy is exactly about the freedom to openly discuss, the freedom to openly agree or disagree. Leaders tend to exploit, particularly personalistic leaders, tend to exploit possibilities, but they are, hundreds of different types. Some could be dramatic economic downturns, such as those that my colleagues were discussing. Others might have to do with a crisis whereby a significant number of outsiders, of people who do not belong, people of different religion, different skin color, are knocking at the doors because they're fleeing violence, they're fleeing dictatorship, war. So the opportunities are various. They can be political, they can be social. They need not be clearly defined. What the political entrepreneur will do is to frame the debate, organize the people, and create that kind of linchpin that we discussed, whereby he, she is the fountain of security, of goodness for the people, versus the others. The others, either those who are coming in, those who support those who are coming in, and we, the ones in fear, the ones who are concerned about changes in our everyday lifestyle, will tend to flock towards this bubble of supposed security. Of course, it's just supposed, and it cannot necessarily be delivered. I'd argue that, in fact, democracy tends to deliver quite suboptimal outcomes. I subscribe more to a Churchillian perspective of democracy. It's the worst form of government except for all the other ones that have been tried. The two very important things it manages to do is to structure succession politics in a predictable manner, in order that we know, even in a case like the United States today, and even with the president we ended up with, that probably, some people would say, that's really, outside the ballpark. That was an aberration. If you go to Latin America, if you go to Asia, if you go to Africa, and democracy is relatively weak, the types of leaders you can get from one government to the next are much more polarized, much more different than the difference between a Donald Trump and a Bernie Sanders, believe it or not. So succession politics, as being structured in that manner, has helped particularly the West to create continuity of rule, continuity of leadership, which other regimes cannot provide.
All right, so speaking of political entrepreneurs, and which may be code for the authoritarians who are trying to exploit populism, there's the phenomenon of Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's coined the phrase illiberal democracy. So we have this, it seems like a new phenomenon where you have liberal democracy, and now you have illiberal democracies where populist movements morph into this sort of surrendering of rights in the name of strong leadership. And yet they're elected leaders who are anti-democratic in some ways. Is this another unsettling development?
Yeah, I think it is. And there's a debate in political science about whether or not the term liberal democracy is helpful. Because some people think that it concedes too much, that to call some figures like Viktor Orban Democrats at all is to sort of miss the point. I defend the concept, and I'll explain quickly why. There was a big referendum in Switzerland about 5 years ago at this point, in which Swiss people were asked to vote whether they wanted to ban the building of minarets, of the towers that are part of mosques. And a majority of the Swiss people, 58% of the people, voted to ban the building of minarets, so that the Swiss constitution now reads, and I quote, "There's freedom of religion in Switzerland, full stop. The building of minarets is forbidden, full stop," which has a little bit of a contradiction in it. And a lot of people criticized that referendum as being undemocratic. And I too was horrified by the referendum, but I thought that was really confusing. If you have a referendum in which a majority of people vote for something, and then you call it undemocratic, it's sort of, it bakes too many of the things in the world that we like into the word democratic, and it stops us from thinking clearly. So that's why I think we have to distinguish between the liberal element, the rule of law, individual rights, minority rights, and the democratic element, the collective self-rule. And what populists like Viktor Orban promise to do, and what they do in the first instance, is to speak for the majority of the people while taking away crucial rights of minorities and undermining the rule of law. So they victimize, for example, in many European countries, Muslims, which often, unfortunately, is very popular, and they erect what I would call an illiberal democracy. It's a helpful term. But we always have to remember that illiberal democracies tend to be a stepping stone on the way to outright dictatorship, unless we manage to wrest back the train. Because once you start to undermine the rule of law, once you start to put all of your cronies on the courts so that they say, yes, that's fine, you can outlaw the building of minarets. Once you turn state television channels into propaganda outlets, once you engineer the sale of private television channels into the hands of your friends, once you change the electoral system to give yourself more power, eventually an illiberal democracy becomes illiberal and undemocratic, which is to say a straight-out dictatorship. And that's exactly what's happened in Hungary, which is an incredibly important case, because political scientists, throughout certainly my graduate education, which is not that long ago, were saying that there's certain countries in the world where democracy is safe. Countries in which we've had at least 2 changes of government for free and fair elections, but have a GDP per capita of at least $14,000, there we don't have to worry about it. And Hungary was one of those. And yet Hungary, I would argue, is now a dictatorship at the heart of Europe, at the heart of NATO. And that's a huge problem for those institutions. It's also a huge warning sign of the vulnerability that all democracies still have.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, yes, I think that's an important distinction to make between liberalism and democracy. Democracy is about how countries decide to choose their leaders. So they choose them through elections rather than through hereditary, or because an elite decides, or because the military decides. Liberalism is something very different. It's about how people treat each other. It's about how governments treat their citizens. And liberalism is actually also about putting limits on democracy. And so theoretically, they are absolutely distinct, although I think the point that Yasha makes is important, right? Which is that once you start chipping away at those aspects of liberalism, rule of law, respect for individual rights and minority rights, there is a very strong tendency, therefore, to undermine democracy as well. But I think it's important to distinguish, because it's important for us to think about what it is that we value and what also historically has been more difficult to achieve. And in that regard, the liberalism part is actually historically much rarer, much more difficult to achieve than democracy. As Yasha said, we've had lots and lots of democratic experiments in the past that have not been liberal, that have been democratic in the sense that there have been elections to choose leaders and governments, but that have not been able to achieve, again, full rule of law, respect for individual rights, respect for minority rights. And so it's important to distinguish those things so that we can understand what it is that troubles us and what it is that's problematic. With regards to the Hungarian case, Yasha is absolutely right, I think. The sort of moves by Orban, despite the fact that he has won elections, have not been truly democratic, in the sense that he's used his powers to undermine a lot of the things that would make those elections actually really reflect the will of the people. But I would also say that Hungary is a case which, yes, has a relatively high GDP, and it had a couple of elections. But as you said before, I mean, democracy tends to take this kind of winding path. Hungary is also a country that has absolutely no previous experience with either democracy or liberalism. It's also a relatively new country, and one that has spent much of its independence under sort of colonial occupation by the Soviets. So while I absolutely think this is a tragic case, and certainly a case that the Europeans in particular should be ashamed about, because it unfolded within the context of Hungary being part of the European Union, I would say it's not...
And they're not doing anything about it,
yes,
shamefully.
Yes, very little about it indeed. I would say that we should also sort of step back and think a little bit about, again, the sort of experiences many of these new democracies have had, and what could historically or comparatively be, sort of predicted to happen in them.
Just to second very quickly something that Sherry says, it's indeed clear that liberalism tends to be much rarer than democracy. When we talk just about Western countries, it's almost automatic that people can start doing checklists. Okay, what's the state of the rule of law? What's the state of the courts, accountability, governance, transparency? You look at the rest of the world, and there's very little rule of law in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, but there is democracy. There are recurrent, regular elections. Presidents, prime ministers come and go. And particularly in the context after the Cold War finished, 1989, 1991, there was a rush throughout the developing world to adopt a minimum of democracy to gain credence in a new global order where many of these very dependent countries relied on the goodwill of rich countries to receive aid, to receive technical assistance. They were not going to do it with dictators. So democracy seems to have colonized a lot of developing countries, but there's a complete absence of the liberal aspect, the respect for individual rights. So much so that today in political science, at least for the developing world, people wouldn't just say there's a dictatorship. They say there can still be free elections and you can have alternation between center-left, center-right, middle of the road. That can still happen, and the life of the people continues to be subjected to arbitrariness, to no rule of law whatsoever. They call this now competitive authoritarianism, which makes perfect sense in the absence of individual rights, in the absence of liberalism.
So I think it depends on which vantage point you look at it from, right? That's an important point. If you come from a country that's a straightforward dictatorship, competitive authoritarianism doesn't sound very appealing and people laugh, but that's probably a step up. Now, when you do look at it from some of the countries in which populists are rising, in which I think they are changing the political system in a way that takes us closer to a system of competitive authoritarianism, that's a really frightening prospect. And it's a really frightening prospect for the things that Francisco emphasized, the extent to which citizens suddenly live under the arbitrariness of a ruler, the extent to which what they can say or even what kind of business they can successfully run depends on their political connections, on whether they abstain from criticizing the prime minister and the president, the kind of way in which minorities no longer enjoy secure rights but might be sacrificed to some kind of witch hunt or some kind of a propaganda effort by the prime minister. I also do think that while you can sometimes sustain real meaningful elections in those systems, there is always the danger of one of the people who just won entrenching their power. And so from the perspective of very stable democracies, the prospect of competitive authoritarianism is not just a danger if you care about liberal rights, it is also a danger if you care about the security of democracy itself.
Do you have a sense that after the end of the Cold War, that liberal democracies essentially declared victory and assumed that then they would be ascendant for that post-Cold War period, and that they just relaxed and did not promote liberal values enough and almost created the conditions where the neglect of these liberal rights and values were just so neglected that other things rushed into the vacuum? I've seen that critique, that it's that we, the end of history after the end of the Cold War.
Right. I mean, I think we need to distinguish between a few different spheres here. I mean, as intellectuals and academics, we like to think that what we do matters greatly in the world, and when we get something wrong, then the world suffers, and when we get something right, we can go and rescue the world. And I think it's important to be a little skeptical of that. So certainly I think there was a real intellectual failing. I think that, and by the way, I think Francis Fukuyama, who's often associated with that, was in many ways less guilty of it than some of the people who made fun of him. So I don't want to sort of focus it too closely on him. But there was a very broad sense that there's all of these countries that fulfill those criteria. There was political scientists that talked about those, not Francis Fukuyama, once you have $14,000 GDP per capita, once you've had these changes of government for free and fair elections, you're safe. And there was an incredibly optimistic vision of a world, because it meant that, of course, North America and Western Europe and certain parts of Asia and a couple of places in Latin America would be democracies forever. And as we'd have economic development in other parts of the world, those would join the column of countries that is safely democratic. And so the worst case scenario is that the world is going to get a little bit better, and the best case scenario is that everywhere is going to be a democracy 20 years from now. And that was naive. We didn't think seriously enough about the fact that there might be certain conditions governing that democratic stability which could go away and which could erode the cohesion of this set of countries. Now, I do think there was real political mistakes as well. I do think we didn't take seriously enough the important task of actually evangelizing the basic values of liberal democracy. I do think that politicians have become, in many cases, incredibly complacent, as we are seeing, for example, with the utter shameful failure of European political parties in standing up to something like Viktor Orban's Fidesz party. There's probably very different economic policies we could have had to ensure that citizens feel like they are part of a common destiny. But it's unclear to me how big a difference all of those things would have made. So we shouldn't just jump from, we didn't think about this critically enough, to this is why it's happening. It may be that a lot of these bad developments would have happened even if we'd had a clearer conception of the world and even if we'd run the right policies.
And Sherry, I know you wanted to talk about the decay of the social democratic left of center parties in Europe. Do you have a sense of how that occurred and where it's moving?
So I actually think this relates to some of the points that Yasha just made. I mean, again, I think that the sort of the sin, so to speak, of the sort of moment that you spoke of was a sort of triumphalism that made us perhaps a little blind to some of the inherent problems that go with actually trying to build successful liberal democracies. I think the assumption was with the end of the Cold War that democracy had triumphed and everything would sort of be shiny and happy from then, not recognizing that, again, historically, liberal democracy, as we've all discussed, is a very, very rare thing, takes a lot of cultivation, takes a lot of effort, and that to just assume that countries were going to sort of go from a place like Hungary with absolutely no history of liberalism or democracy and sort of jump into the category of Sweden was historically naive, and I think therefore we're perhaps more surprised by the backsliding that has occurred than we should have been. I think one of the things that we need to think about, one of the connections or sort of correlations that we need to think about that does also relate, I think, to this period is the decline of a sort of center democratic, social democratic left, which is, I think, a lot of the story of populism in particularly Europe. I think these parties played an incredibly important role within post-war liberal democracies. Historically, they were the home of the folks who felt disadvantaged, disaffected, and they provided a sort of champion for those kinds of people, but one that was very much committed to playing within the democratic rules of the game. I think as those parties declined, and in particular, at this moment after the Cold War, moved very much to the center, particularly on economic policies, a lot of folks who felt left behind, so to speak, by a lot of the trends of the last years, all of a sudden didn't have the home that they would have had in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s for an expression of this dissatisfaction. And so they were left looking for new champions. And if we look at voting data in Europe, for instance, we can see that a lot of the people who we might, again, historically have expected to vote for these parties now vote populist. So there's definitely been a shift in voters. But I think, again, the whole political system has kind of been thrown off by the decline of these parties. It also has something to do with the rise, I think, of a focus on social and cultural issues. As economic issues became something that the left and the right no longer differed greatly on, that the left no longer offered significant differences on, there was a very strong incentive for parties and politicians to focus on social and cultural issues more. And I think this was both deadly for the left and I think deadly for democracy. These are much harder issues for democracies to compromise or bargain over than economic issues are.
Absolutely.
We've passed the 20-minute mark remaining in the program, so I've been asked to ask some questions from the audience. Number one up is, what would a healthy populism look like? Could there exist a populism that is compatible with a pluralist, multi-ethnic, liberal democracy. Yes, Francisco?
Oh, a while ago I mentioned that I did not think that populism was necessarily a terrible tragedy. There are important examples from Latin America. Latin America, in the course of between the 1920s and the 1940s, the biggest countries in the region, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, created political systems that were led by populist leaders. And these populist leaders, Juan Perón, Getulio Vargas, Lázaro Cárdenas, created, in fact, the institutions that allowed the countries to grow for 30 years, to create alliances between state, organized workers, and capital. And the key issue is not only did they build a modern state, the thing they did right, which many populists do not do, is that they left power. They institutionalized a new model of political economic relations, but they didn't stay there forever, and neither did they personalize power once they had created that system. They stepped down or were brought down, as in the case of Perón and Vargas. Cárdenas stepped down of his own will, but the systems they created are what made the possibility for a modern Latin America, a urban, industrialized, significant social mobility, growth of middle classes, to happen. Without those populist leaders, we don't know. The counterfactual is too complex. But those leaders had the virtue that they did not personalize power. They managed to institutionalize power in what used to be oligarchic societies, where the few had most of the wealth, the privilege, the influence, and the vast majority of people had very little. They created a less unequal pyramid, which was institutionalized. It started running on rules, on laws, on norms, not on the whims of these individuals. So the difference between institutionalization and personalization of power is critical. And of course, many people would say, I'd rather not toss the coin, because more often than not, people with power will like to stay and will like to amass more, and potentially, more often than not, they tend to personalize it. There are, however, examples that show that social and economic progress sustained, was capable, and it was led by populist leaders.
I'd love to speak to that for one moment. I mean, look, if a stop clock is right twice a day, populist leaders tend to be right 3 or 4 times a day. And it's more in their sort of analysis of the problem than it is in the solutions that they tend to offer. So, you know, a lot of the time, populists do give voice to very real frustrations. And so the more screwed up your political system is, the more they probably describe its problems with real force. You know, there's many democracies in the world which are deeply corrupt. And so there's contexts in which populists who say everything is corrupt, none of this is working, are sort of right. Now, the problem is that, at least in the last 25 or 30 years empirically, they tend not to actually solve the problems that they point out. So on corruption, for example, with a colleague, Jordan Kyle, we've done a big database of populist governments, left, right, ideologically amorphous, since 1990. And it turns out that on average, countries ruled by populists actually become much more corrupt as a result of their kind of government. And so it's certainly possible that there's individual cases in which populist leaders turn out to step away from power, not to institutionalize or personalize their own power, to actually combat corruption in the way they promise. What is much more common, unfortunately, is the case of Turkey, where no parallels here. The president has hugely enriched his son-in-law and recently appointed his son-in-law to a very important economic role in the state, actually having the chutzpah to publish the sort of order by which he was appointed, which was nominated, seconded, and confirmed by Recep Erdogan in 3 separate signatures.
Let's see. One panelist said pessimism is not helpful. I think that was you, Sherry, especially in the current environment. True, but explain why we should not be particularly pessimistic these days. What are the historic precedents that might give us some comfort?
Great. So I think that there's a whole variety of reasons not to be overly pessimistic, the most obvious of which is empirical, which is we still have more democracies today than we've really ever had in the past. The wave of democracy that began in the 20th century remains by far the most successful democratic wave meaning a period in time when a bunch of countries move into that democratic category. So again, much more successful, not only in the sense that we still have many more democracies today than we've ever had in the past, but with waves always comes an undertow. And the undertow of this wave has been much less, I guess an undertow is less powerful, less than in any other wave. So we've had less backsliding into authoritarianism. So we know the cases where that's happened. We talk about them all the time, Hungary and Turkey. But if you look at previous democratic waves, 1848, 1918, 1945, those had much greater, again, I'm not sure what the right adjective is there, greater undertow. So I think from an empirical perspective, we should recognize that the world is more democratic than it was before this wave began. Again, I agree with Yasha. We both went to graduate school, although obviously at different times. There was a tendency to kind of assume that certain types of factors, economic level, number of elections, were the things that determined whether or not democracy survived. We can see now, as Yasha has pointed out, that that alone is not enough. But again, as I've also pointed out, if we think about a lot of the countries that made transitions during the late 20th and early 21st century, countries in Eastern Europe, places like Turkey, a lot of these countries really did not have also what is important, which is namely a lot of experience with democracy, lots of experience with liberalism. And so the fact that their democratic experiments have turned out to be somewhat weak or wobbly or illiberal, again, from a historical perspective, should not probably strike us as that unusual. In fact, again, if one was to go back in history, one would find that that is the norm. So I think we should be very concerned about democratic backsliding. It is bad. But I think from a historical comparative perspective, it's not necessarily as bad as a lot of people think. And to get back to your other question, I think that maybe because there was an assumption at the end of the 20th century with the collapse of communism that liberal democracy would triumph by default, and it doesn't happen that way. Liberal democracy only is able to thrive in very, very specific circumstances with a lot of preconditions. And so I think that's what we're experiencing now, and we're correctly disappointed, but perhaps we shouldn't have expected so much in the first place.
Yeah, Yasha?
A couple of quick thoughts. The first is that if you want to settle the most important debate of this morning, which is what adjective to use with undertow, the URL is over there. Feel free to fill your submissions. You'll read them out at the end. The second is that I think this is a really important point, which is that we have to distinguish between the different symptoms of a democratic crisis at the moment. One of them is that there's plenty of countries in which we might hope for democracy to stabilize, which are now experiencing real democratic backsliding. So when you look at important countries like Kenya or Nigeria or Thailand, you see a real challenge to democracy. And that is what is captured in this aggregate data that Larry Diamond talks about in terms of democratic recession, which President Daniels mentioned earlier today. I think that's very important, but as Sherry points out, that doesn't worry me as much as some other things, because with each democratic wave, we have seen a counter wave. We've seen some of those countries where we're sort of at the frontiers of democracy, not quite being able to sustain democracy, and we shouldn't be surprised by that in itself. I think the thing that's different now is that we're seeing elements of the same thing that's happening in Turkey, that's happening in some other countries, even within the countries where we're supposed to be safe. Even in Western Europe, even in the United States. And that, to me, is much more concerning, because that actually can really throw off the basic view we had of how the world works and the basic optimism we had about how the zone of democracy is definitely going to expand over time. So I'm heartbroken when I see my friends in Kenya struggle to protect and preserve their democracy, but if democracy there failed, it wouldn't change my picture of the world. If it fails in a hugely important country like the United States, or even in a relatively small country like Austria, that would radically change my view of how the social world works in a way that's much more concerning. And I do think there's no conclusive evidence there that it's possible for democracy to fail in Austria or the United States, but I do think we've seen over the last years that it's much more brittle in these countries than we could have imagined a short while ago.
One other element I would add, following my two colleagues, would be that during this period of democratic recession or backsliding, it's important to remember that countries which are ruled currently by populist leaders can in fact end up becoming more entrenched. That leader can end up becoming stronger when they listen to the criticism that the West puts at them. You are not a liberal democracy. You, Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, Mr. Putin, Mr. Xi Jinping, you are not liberals. That assertion by the West, by those of us who are concerned about the democratic recession, in fact plays to the strength of populist leaders who say, this is a new attempt at soft imperialism, at soft colonialism. What they mean by liberal democracy is that we just have to open all our markets so that the great, massive corporations, great efficiency can come and rule again as they did in the 19th century. What they mean by democracy is, at the end of the day, look at them. It's just a clique of people from country clubs who end up ruling. It's not, in fact, meritocratic. We have to be careful about how we frame the criticism about populism, about non-democracy, because in many ways we play to the tune of these leaders who end up, even if they're not running the country very well, even if things are not going great, they certainly feel aggrieved when, like little minors, are told off by the United States or Great Britain or NATO. That plays to the strength of the authoritarians.
Someone has helpfully said, I'm a surfer, it's a strong or weak undertow.
Thank you.
Let's see. My question is for the whole panel. This audience member says, if populism is to be feared in a democracy, what should a popular resistance to power look like? It says, if political institutions are not responding to the people, as that group is politically and contentiously denied, what mechanisms do you find for making demands and for making choices between those often conflicting demands?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think we can see some elements of this kind of response already in places like the United States. So, I mean, it's not a panacea, but things that we can do to make our institutions more responsive, trying to reform voting laws to make voting more accessible to everyone and easier, trying to figure out ways to root corruption out of the system, trying to figure out ways to make parties perhaps more responsive to people rather than special interests through funding. There's obviously limits that the Supreme Court has placed on this, but those kinds of sort of movements I think are quite helpful because, again, what populists sort of seem to thrive on is this idea, as my colleagues have pointed out, that the system is unresponsive. And so things that can help, again, kind of make politicians, parties, governments more responsive. Again, it's not a panacea, and you definitely want limits on that as well. But I think the perception of corruption in a lot of Western countries in particular, where I agree with Yasha, the trends are the most worrisome. I think that this is a critique that needs to be taken very seriously, and there are concrete reforms that can help alleviate, if not solve, that those kinds of problems.
The other thing I would add is that if we think of our political system as a liberal democracy, or Americans can say a democratic republic, I think that gets at the same idea. We always need to think about how to manage the tension between these two elements, right? We can only preserve the two elements if we persuade a majority of the people to actually vote for laws and politicians who are willing to respect minorities, for example. And so there are some moments in which we might have to step in to preserve the liberal elements of a system. I think it's right of the Supreme Court to step in to rule down laws which would victimize people on the basis of their race or on the basis of their religion, unquestionably. But we also have to be careful about how much we, quote unquote, as liberal elites, try to impose our preferences on people. And we have to tolerate some discomfort when people vote for things that we dislike, that we think are wrong, morally wrong, empirically wrong, silly economic policy or whatever. But if it doesn't actually undermine these basic individual rights, if it doesn't actually challenge the rule of law in a fundamental and dangerous way, then the way to avoid those policies is not for courts to step in and change them. It's not to take certain decisions out of democratic contestation and give them to bureaucrats and technocrats to make. It's to argue harder with our fellow citizens to persuade a majority of them to embrace what we think are the right policies. And if we fail to do that, then we shouldn't shove those policies down the throat. We should say, all right, we'll give you your policy, and we'll keep arguing for why we think those other policies are better. And I think on a whole host of issues, politicians have gotten that wrong in the last few decades, and it's one of the reasons why so many people feel nobody's listening to us anyway, this system isn't working, so why don't we give that crazy guy over there a chance?
I would add just very quickly that some of the current instances of populism which have not been as dysfunctional, many of the fallouts as a consequence of the Great Recession in Europe, the way that the system has been revitalized was through the eruption of populist leader and populist movements against austerity, against the European Commission imposing conditions on countries that were already on their knees, economically speaking. And what has happened, at least in the cases of Greece, Italy, Spain, has been that those movements, which really started not at all as mainstream, but rather as challenging the system from outside, once they ended up winning power, they were absorbed into the party system. And those people have been ruling not by shutting the courts or packing the courts, not by weakening the power of the legislature in order to strengthen themselves, the executive. So there's been significant revitalization of individuals' frustrations, concerns, through movements that started from the outside but were able to be absorbed within the party system. Now, that's not a guarantee, and I'm not saying that Hungary or Poland or Slovakia will do that. But we've seen it in Southern Europe, for example, which has a very strong tradition of people coming out to the streets, protesting, and the system has been revitalized by those cases. I'm not so pessimistic about them.
Well, I see the time has expired. Thank you very much for your eloquent discussion of this important subject, and I hope it was helpful to everybody here.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Francisca. Thanks, Sherry. This is very good.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and continue on our program. We have a very full morning, and I want to make sure we can stay on time. We have speakers who are coming and going, and I want to make sure they can make their trains and planes and everything else they need to do, along with all of you. So I am pleased now to welcome to the stage our second panel, who will be discussing discourse on the right. This panel will be moderated by Bill Kristol, who is the founding director of Defending Democracy Together. And joining Bill will be Max Boot, Senior Fellow for National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, Jennifer Rubin, opinion writer for The Washington Post, Pete Wehner, Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and contributing opinion writer for The New York Times, and Dana White, former assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs. As a reminder, this panel, along with all of our discussions, is being put on in the spirit of inclusive engagement and discourse. We will provide time at the end, as we did in the last panel, to consider audience questions as well. Once again, you can find the URL on the screens where you can submit your questions. And now I would like to turn this over to Bill. One other housekeeping note. For those of you who are interested in taking notes during the panel, if you look in the back of your program, there are actually several pages provided for you to take notes. So in case you are interested in remembering what you're hearing today. All right, with that, we'll turn it over to you, Bill. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having, I think I speak for everyone, and saying this is not the usual kind of room we have these panel discussions in. In Washington, they tend to happen in either government buildings, which are whatever government buildings look like, or think tanks, boring office buildings, and this is more like Max's home library. It reminds me of that. I thought we'd have an informal discussion and try to, go back and forth and not have speeches. These are all distinguished people whose writings and contributions to public life you can read and read about, so we won't belabor that. But I think the title we were given is Discourse on the Right. I'm not sure how many people here are still exactly on the right, but maybe that's a good thing to begin with. I think Max has written a book about how he's not sure he's a conservative anymore, and Pete's left the Republican Party, and I'm not sure about Jen and Dana and myself. I'm pretending still to be a Republican, so I don't know. Discourse on the right. Max, is there a right still? And if there is, what is its character?
Well, that's a great question, Bill, and welcome to everybody here. Glad you could make it. Delighted to be here. Truly magnificent surrounding, and I love the symbolism of discussing the assault on truth and sanity in America in a repository of knowledge. I think there's something very appropriate about that. I just wrote a column, I don't know when, yesterday, I guess, about how the neocon label, which is one that has sometimes been attached to folks like Bill and me, and I think almost everybody here probably, except for Dana.
But you could be one too.
You can be one too. How the neocon label has become utterly meaningless and unmoored from its original meaning, and trying to actually suggesting kind of in a line at the end that I don't really think of myself as a neocon anymore so much as an ex-con. I don't know how to define myself other than that. I'm certainly not a Republican anymore, and I really don't know. I have an idea of what the Republican Party stands for, which is basically whatever Donald J. Trump tells it to stand for. And so I know I'm opposed to that. But is there an independent conservatism in America anymore? I just don't know. And I think, frankly, I have a lot of trouble, looking at the way the conservative movement and the Republican Party produced Donald Trump. I don't think, yes, there are elements in tension with it, but there are also elements that are all too ready to accede to this populist, racist, quasi-fascist takeover of the Republican Party. And I find that deeply disturbing for what it says about a lot of...
This is the panel on the right. So.
Yeah.
Right. It's unusual times we live in, but I don't...
Yeah. It's...
Fair enough, though.
It says something, I think, deeply disturbing to me that so many of my old friends on the right have so readily signed up for somebody who I view as so antithetical to what I regard as being my values as somebody who used to call himself a conservative. It made me really wonder, how do we get to this point? I think there are, trends in American conservatism that sadly have paved the way for Donald Trump. I think there's also more positive trends. I certainly don't want to suggest that you know, it was inevitable that you would wind up with this Trumpian moment, but I think that there were these horrible undercurrents which have now become the main current of conservatism and of the Republican Party, and that's not something I can sign up for. But I mean, I'm not signing up. I'm not a Democrat either. I'm really, at this point, rejecting ideology and trying to embrace a centrist, moderate, sane alternative, because I think ideology, if you adhere to it rigidly, whether on the left or the right, it really cripples critical thought and makes you do a lot of and say a lot of things that are completely at odds with the facts.
Jen, I mean, you've written both about your hopes for the Democratic Party going forward, but also about then occasionally you look at the Democrats and say, well, gee, I hope we could have a Republican challenger to Trump. You've written so often as for the Post and so interestingly on both parties. So where do you think things stand?
Well, again, thank you for bringing me here. I do feel a little bit like a character in the Agatha Christie novel, 10 Little Indians. Every time we look around, you know, we lose another one to the clutches of Trumpism. You know, I think we've all sort of gone on this journey, sort of an emotional, intellectual journey. And it's been a disorienting one because the principles that brought me to at one point identify with the Republican Party and conservatism were freedom, international defense of human rights, free markets, equal opportunity, a belief that markets properly regulated would produce prosperity and widely disperse it in a fair way. And virtually none of those now are front and center or even to be found in the Republican Party. So where do those values, where does that sensibility go? And it's, I think we're at a time where our politics is very divorced from our intellectual life, and maybe that's a comment on all of us, or a failure on all of us, that I think there are people who are trying to wrestle with this problem. Is there an alternative to you know, the most extreme version of the Democratic Party, sort of democratic socialism, that is more akin to where we used to be? Is there something from center left to center right that I think corresponds best to those values that I have? That would be my hope. But I think it's incumbent upon me and perhaps other people who are sort of refugees from the right to kind of look with fresh eyes at what's out there. And I think what I've found, I feel like sort of like Margaret Mead on an expedition in Democrat land, you know, meeting the natives and getting the lay of the land and, you know, who do I need to watch out for and who has the poison darts. You know, to my fascination, and of course all of you know this, is that the moderate wing of the Democratic Party hates the left as much as we used to. And so I'm thinking, hey, that's something we have in common. You know, I think this is the crisis of democracy all over the world. You know, Brexit aside, or maybe because Brexit, look at Great Britain, look at every Western democracy where the center right has completely disappeared. The center left has been under siege and is ineffective or sort of tied itself up in knots. And so what's left, and the hope that I would have is that sort of by foraging for ex-Republicans and trying my best to appeal to more centrist-minded Democrats who have come to appreciate things like the rule of law, separation of powers, strong US presence in the world, human rights, all those things that perhaps were not front and center in their agenda when they were simply given, that we can kind of rebuild this intellectually coherent and governable society. Right now, I'm still looking.
Pete and Dana both served in government, as I did once upon a time, and Pete and I worked together in the education department under President Reagan, and Pete then served in both Bush administrations. So you, from that point of view, I mean, having really been obviously an intellectual as well, and author and so forth, but having really been in the trenches of both the Republican governance and the Republican Party, how do things look to you?
Well, they look pretty bleak. I will say that.
A cheerful panel here, right?
but they're going to get worse. No,
it's John McCain's great line, you know.
Right.
It's always darkest before it turns pitch black.
Exactly.
It's the spirit of this panel, basically. Here. Go ahead.
I want to pick up on this point about the right and conservatism. I actually make a distinction between the two. I still consider myself a conservative, and I don't consider what's going on today on the American right to be remotely conservative. I think now and then there are certain conservative policies that they stumble into or that they believe, but as a philosophy, as a guiding philosophy, I think in many ways what's happening on the right is antithetical to conservatism. I think it's really a kind of crude populism and ethnic nationalism. That's not the conservatism that I learned about or was brought up into, or why I attached myself to that movement. I'll tell you in the conversations, because of my history in the Republican Party, and because of the friends that I have and have had in the Republican Party, I've had countless conversations with people who are varying degrees of pro-Trump, who have asked me about my position because I've been so vocal so early against him. And what I tell them is that the people that know me best throughout my life, I can't think of more than, if you said 20 people, one or two who would be surprised with where I am. And I am where I was on the questions of character and morality, exactly where I was in 1998, when most of the Republican Party and the conservative movement was there too. So I think what has happened is that there has been this fissure that has happened, this break that has happened, and what is now defining much of the Republican Party is this ethnic nationalism and crude populism. And one of the arguments I made, and it wasn't the most important argument that I made, but one of the ones that I did early on when I criticized Trump is I said, don't underestimate his power to redefine the Republican Party and to damage conservatism. And I said, he will be able to do what Hillary Clinton could never do if she won, which is to redefine the GOP. Because she was viewed as an opponent, as an enemy. But if Trump rose up, this would be a takeover, or at least a transformation from within. I'll say one other thing, and I'm guessing, Bill, you and others here on the panel have had this experience, and maybe you in the audience. When I've had private conversations with leaders in Congress, they haven't changed that much. What we're seeing primarily, not exclusively, but primarily is a lack of courage. And Aristotle talked about this, and Churchill, courage is the first virtue, and all the other ones are dependent on it. And so if you have private conversations with these people, they're not that far from where they had been. They're not that far, I would say, from where we are. But what has happened is that Donald Trump tapped into something, a kind of malady in the base. And he has tremendous energy and strength on that side, and the people who stand up to him are endangered. I actually think the political class, by and large, is not as bad a shape as the base. That is what worries me, because I think the pathologies are fairly widespread, and what we're seeing is the political class, to some extent, reacting to it. Maybe we'll get into it, maybe we won't, but that is a deeper question, which is what happened on the right, in the Republican Party, at the base of it, that turned it the direction that it's gone.
Well, we four have all been criticizing, lamenting, trying to do things on the outside over the last couple of years. Dana's been actually serving the country in a very senior position in the Defense Department, Assistant Secretary, I believe, for Public Affairs. I know how senior it is because I was in government, but I also know how senior it is. But just in passing, Dana commented that she got to work every day around 6:30, 6:45, and it was easier because she could park right in the river parking there at the Pentagon, and right near the river entrance. I thought, whoa, that is really senior. The rest of us would visit the Pentagon or have a meeting there, and you park in, 3.2 miles away and take that little shuttle bus. She parks right under the Secretary's office there. So that's genuinely impressive, of all the perks that one can have in government. But I'm curious, if you want to announce Jim Mattis's presidential candidacy for 2020 right here, feel free to do that. That would be good. Make some news here for this conference, and I would be cheered up. But how does it? You were in there every day working very hard for Secretary of Defense, who I think it's fair to say was conducting a trying to conduct or shape a foreign policy that was a more traditional looking foreign policy, but obviously thought also some of the things that were happening were reasonable and stuff. So I'm very curious about your perspective.
So I think I'd just start by saying Secretary Mattis has been elected to something. He was just elected to the board of his food bank in the Tri-City area, so he's very excited.
Cheered up, Bill.
He's there.
One food bank at a time. That's
what Tri-Cities are we talking about here?
So it's the Richland area. So the secretary is from Richland, Washington. And
Washington State.
Washington State. So he's
good.
very excited to be back on the food bank board. So
less as well qualified as a lot of the Democratic candidates. Right.
First, I'd just like to start with saying I served in the Trump administration. I am a Republican from way back. I was inspired by Jack Kemp while I was in high school. And I'm still for limited government and a strong defense and free markets. I think what I see Trump, perhaps the greatest benefit he's had, is I think he's tapped into a forgotten people. For me, the Republican Party had always been about empowering people. That's how I saw it. And regardless of how you feel about President Trump, I think it is important to understand that he tapped into a lot of people who had been forgotten by the political class and by the media. He won Pennsylvania. So when we think about, historians will talk about his legacy, but I do think it's very important to remember that ultimately I feel like the Republican Party is a big tent. I think it is a place where all ideas should be embraced and at least discussed. And frankly, both parties forgot about a huge part of our population, and they're just as important. And I think that was a good wake-up call for those of us who live in the bubble of Washington, that there's an America out there that is hurting, and frankly, that his message motivated a population, that he motivated them. So I would say, as perhaps the greatest contribution President Trump has made is he's made us aware of what we didn't know. So I will sort of leave it at that.
No, I think that's a good point. I'll just say a word. Whenever I give speeches more campus, and I guess this is sort of a campus, and what's happening, it is worth remembering 45% of Republican primary voters in 2016 voted for Trump all in. If you add up all the primaries, he was running in the 30s, mid-high 30s, until various opponents dropped out and got up into the mid-40s, never got a majority of the vote. Bernie Sanders got, I think it was 43% of the Democratic vote. It's pretty unusual in American politics and unprecedented in modern American political history for candidates in both parties to get such almost 50% of the vote who were running against the establishments and elites and traditional policies and traditional leaders of their own party. Occasionally you get a Goldwater rebellion or a McGovern rebellion against their own party, so to speak, and that happens usually in one party, not in both at the same time. And more usually you get your protest candidates, the Buchanans or the outside businessmen or whatever, on Howard Dean on either side, and then they lose to the establishment candidates. It does show, I think, Dana's point that 2016, the degree of unhappiness, now we can say whether it was reasonable or not, and were things really that bad in Middle America, and all these other questions, but the degree of feeling detached from the elites and the establishments of both parties was pretty substantial, and not something one could just wish away and assume that maybe it'll just go away, as a temporary thing, but feels like, given the global replications of this or echoes of this, it feels like something that's not going away very quickly.
Let me just jump in real quick on that, Bill, because there was a group of us, they were referred to as reformicons, reform conservatives, that actually made that diagnosis years ago, years before Donald Trump got in to the race, which made roughly this critique, which is that the Republican Party was out of touch with middle-class voters. I think that's fair. I think where I disagree with Dana to some probably fair extent is the Trump phenomenon. The first thing I would say is tapping into feelings of the citizenry, that can be good and it can be not good. I mean, you know, you can go back and read one of Lincoln's sort of lesser-known speeches, the Young Men's Lyceum speech in 1838, I think, where he talked about the danger of the mob and the passion, and that demagogues can tap into those things. And the founders themselves were that concerned. The reason we have, in large part, the government that we have, is they didn't want direct democracy. They knew the countries were subject to and individuals were subject to popular passions, and we needed something to refine it and to distance ourselves in government. The thing that puzzled me about the phenomenon about Trump was he tapped into a frustration, but he was such a profoundly imperfect vessel on any criteria that I would have thought made sense. For people to think that he could make the case. He literally could not string together 3 policy sentences coherently during the debates. I don't think it was his agenda particularly that appealed to people. I think that it was his style. And this is both anecdotal, and I think it's also bears up to some extent from the data. What I heard during the 2016 campaign is some version of this, and I'm guessing each of you heard it too, which is, look, he's imperfect, he's rough around the edges, but he's a fighter. He hates them. We're in a knife fight, and he's going to bring a Glock to the knife fight. And this is another thing I heard. The Bushes, the McCains, they're good men. They were better men than Donald Trump. But they were too genteel. They weren't tough enough. And what they saw in Donald Trump was an aggression and a dehumanization of the opponents that really tapped into it. I was in a panel session with Arlie Hochschild, a very distinguished historian at Berkeley, just before the election. This was out at Stanford, and she had actually done a book, it's a marvelous book called Strangers in Their Own Land, where she wanted to understand the Tea Party movement. So she went actually to the kind of belly of the beast, the bio country in Louisiana. And she talked about how much affection she had for the people there. And she's liberal. She's a professor at Berkeley. But on a human level, she liked them. But I remember
on the human level, she's still a decent person.
Yeah. On a philosophical level, she was less enchanted by them. But I remember what she told me on the car ride over. She said, "The thing you have to understand, Pete, is that these people feel humiliated and made fun of. And they view Trump as an antidepressant, as somebody who will fight for them." I think that's what happened. And I think so what Trump did is he may have taken these sentiments, of which I think they were complicated. Some of it was economic, some of it was a sense of lost cultural status. But then he took it and then he corrupted it. And when you do that as a leader, there may be worse sins in public life, but that's awfully high among them. And so I'm not sure that he tapped into, well, he certainly didn't take those grievances and channel them in a way that would be productive, and certainly not toward noble ends.
Yeah. Jen and then Max.
You know, I think what he exposed, I think, rather than this set of people, is the extreme and toxic inequality and divisiveness in American society. And we have been wrestling with this and wrestling unsuccessfully, and it has gotten worse. And I think you can either see some of these people as true victims, or you can see them as, I think some of the data show that these are people who are have used to being the center of American culture and society, and now for the first time, white Protestant Americans are in a minority. And this is really a rearguard action of race and class to a certain extent, and they are shoving back because they feel like something has been taken from them. Whether you think that is a legitimate feeling, or whether you think that is the ultimate of white privilege and entitlement is an interesting debate. But I think when you get down to it, the Republican Party used to, we were all part of it, used to accuse the Democratic Party of being all about race, all about dividing people up in little chunks, all about class warfare. But I think what the right failed to see is that the pristine notion of a rising tide lifts all boats, that a colorblind society has some fundamental weaknesses. And in the 21st century, although that may be the ideal, that's an insufficient response to what's happened in the world. And I would just look at my own view, for example, on taxes and government. I think in 1980, tax cuts were a pretty good response to the climate. Now, when you have such gross inequities between rich and poor, and when you have fundamental problems about the skills and abilities of people to survive and prosper in a globalized economy, that, in my view, is just completely wrong. It's completely off base. And I think this recognition that conservatism really didn't adequately wrestle with issues of class and issues of race has come back to haunt us all. And I think in working through these problems, we see what it was that people grasp onto. I don't know about you, but something about this college scam crisis, I don't think Johns Hopkins was mentioned, is infuriating. And what's infuriating is exactly what many of the Democrats have been saying for years, which is, look at the privilege. How can a school have 60% of their students be from the top 1%? And that, in a way, is sort of a metaphor, I think, for the society. And we haven't come to a good conclusion.
Max?
I think at the 30,000-foot level, what's basically happening right now is somewhat similar to what happened in the 19th century. In both times, you've had a major shift in the economy. You had the shift from the agricultural to the industrial economy in the 19th century, which created the greatest explosion of wealth in human history, but it also led to great inequality, it led to great poverty, it led to a lot of great evils. And a part of the response of that was there was certainly the reform of capitalism, which had to occur with adding welfare state protections to the capitalist model. And that was the ultimate solution. But at the same time, you also had the extremes of left and right, the rise of Marxism and fascism. Both arose at that time, I think, basically in response to the economic changes that were convulsing society. Today, I think you have something very similar going on with the change from the industrial to the information age economy. Again, creating the greatest explosion of wealth in human history, record numbers of billionaires, especially in Palo Alto. But it's also leaving people behind, it's causing anxiety, and it's also combined with record numbers of refugees in the world, something like 60 million, and high levels of immigration and changing demographics. And I think, one of the fundamental fact that explains the rise of Trump is the fact that we are destined by the 2040s to be a majority-minority country. As Jen was saying, the white ascendancy of America, the white domination of America is over, and it's causing a lot of anxiety among a lot of white people, especially older, lesser educated white people who watch Fox News. They're very anxious about what's going on, and there is genuine hurt out there, and there is genuine resentment. There is certainly a lot of industrial towns in places in the Midwest have been left behind by the changes that are producing a massive explosion of wealth on both coasts. And there is no question that there is a genuine hurt that Donald Trump managed to tap into. But what he has done, I believe, in the form of so many demagogues is, as the previous panel was discussing, so many populists, instead of addressing their actual needs and offering an actual program that will deal with why they're hurting and what can be done about it, he is channeling their resentment and grievances against people of different skin colors and different religions. He is basically saying, if you're hurting, it's the fault of these caravans, of these Latino refugees who are going to come here and rape and pillage America. If you're hurting, it's somebody else's fault. It's the fault of the Muslims. Let's keep them all out of America. So he is conjuring up some very ugly hatreds in response to what are some genuine problems. And what is shocking to me, what is truly shocking to me that I would have never believed, is how much of the Republican base eats this stuff up. And what I will say is this: I do not believe that every Donald Trump voter or supporter is a racist, but what I do believe is that for every Donald Trump voter or supporter, the fact that he is an open and blatant racist is not a breaking point for them. That is something they are willing to overlook, something they're willing to swallow in the service of some larger good, tax cuts, judges, whatever it may be. And I find that to be monstrous and indefensible. And this is the party that I was part of, and I cannot be a part of it anymore.
Let me pivot a little bit to international politics, since this initiative, of which is a co-host of this, is a global one, and we've discussed the global situation as well last night at the Canadian Embassy, as well as in some of the panels today, obviously, as well as the American situation. So let me ask Dana this, since she's been governor most recently. Leaving aside, in a certain sense, the past. People like me would wax nostalgic about 75 years of the global international order and how important it is to defend that, and we shouldn't toss it away cavalierly because we're a little annoyed that some European allies don't pay their share in defense and so forth. But going forward, I'm curious, how much do you think, if let's say it's 2024, we're past whatever this period is, and you're being consulted, as you would be, by various presidential candidates, maybe mostly Republicans, and what would you say? What would you tell them to focus on in terms of, I think everyone on this panel has sort of been in favor of human rights, democracy promotion as part of a strong American leadership. Is that gone? Can that come back? Is that, and what other issues would you rank? There's so many things to worry about in the world, obviously, but what would your kind of core message be for someone who wanted to be president?
I think the fact that we do need to pay, that person needs to pay increasing attention to alliances and partnerships. The things and the threats, the cyber threats, the gray zone kind of threats that we face, they require cooperation. They don't know borders. There are a lot of things that right now we just need others' help with. So I think first and foremost, it's protecting our alliances and partnerships and fostering those and really investing in them. It's more than the kinetic threat. If you think about what Russia's done, if you think about what the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Chinese do, that requires really a global response. It requires global awareness and integrated, frankly, capabilities. And we have to look to each other to address them. So that would be the first thing I would tell a presidential possible candidate. The second thing is, I think you have to look at civil society. One of the initiatives of Renew Democracy Initiative is education. You can't expect Americans to invest blood and treasure around the world if you do not have a population that understands the value of what we have, the value of democracy, and the value of your participation in it. And that's not just voting, that's understanding who your city councilman is, that's understanding your school board. And that has incredible national security implications, because right now, 99% of Americans are not serving in uniform. Our military relies on 1% of our population, and it's become a family business. 80% of the military has at least one parent who serves. So we have to, as a society, remember that we're investing in each other, and you have to kind of care, because if we don't understand that, and if you don't foster that as leaders, frankly, it makes it a lot more difficult to care about an ally or a partner if you don't know your neighbor, if you don't know the guy next door, and certainly if you don't care about what happens to him or her.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm just curious, the rest of us here too. How much, post 2025, are the threats sort of comparable to 1945 to 2015? We just need to tweak a little bit. Or is the new world of authoritarian regimes with cyber capabilities and the ability to corrupt other parties in other countries and so forth really kind of a different kind of threat that requires different institutional arrangements in the US government, different civic arrangements, maybe national service, if we don't have the kind of unity that the Cold War, World War II and its legacy, and then the Cold War provided? Max, you were a genuine scholar of international politics and the history of war and peace, unlike the rest of us who just play that on TV. So You go first. I mean, how new an era are we entering? It's an honest, just intellectual question, really.
A new era in terms of?
International relations. I mean, how much will historians, I don't know, 100 years from now say there was this period from 45 to 2015, and that was one thing, and it was okay, actually, but we're now just in sort of uncharted waters, or how much is it sort of the same still?
I'm mildly pessimistic about the chances of reassembling the world as we knew it in the so-called post-war era, which I think it was already starting to wane with the end of the Cold War. You saw the rise of isolationism, really on both the left and the right, and I think you saw certainly accelerated with the Iraq War, which I supported and now regret doing so. I think it was a horrendous mistake, and I think one of the costs of the Iraq War is it really shattered American support for the burden of international leadership. And you saw President Obama was elected because he opposed the Iraq War. And he was still more or less in the foreign policy tradition, but he was pulling back clearly, saying leadership, from behind, nation building begins at home. He was responding to a war weariness on the part of the American populace, and I think Donald Trump has accelerated that and put it on steroids. He is the first president since 1945 who fundamentally does not believe in the twin pillars of the American world order, which is A, security alliances with fellow democracies, and B, free trade. He does not believe either of those things. He is hostile to both of those tenets. So he is really a throwback to the isolationist and protectionist of the 1930s. And again, one of the most shocking things that I've seen with the rise of Donald Trump is how shallow Republican support for internationalism and free trade has been. They are jettisoning their beliefs at warp speed in order to accommodate Donald Trump. And I think it'll be very hard for them. It's not like you can go back in the safe, open the lock, and take your beliefs out and put them back on after Donald Trump is gone. I think he is changing the nature of the Republican Party. But what I fear is that there may not be that much pushback from the Democratic Party, because Democrats fundamentally agree with Donald Trump in their hostility to free trade. I mean, it's amazing that he, tried to blow up NAFTA and sort of wound up reassembling it with a few changes at the margins. But now Democrats are saying, no, we're not going to approve this thing called the USMCA in lieu of NAFTA because they're even more hostile in many ways to free trade than Donald Trump is. And they're certainly not committed to the kind of American role in the world that previous generations of Democrats, like going back to the days of Harry Truman, were committed to. So I think there's actually a growing sentiment in favor of protectionism and isolationism in America, and maybe there will be a pushback. Maybe there will be, a reaction to Trump, and we'll get a normal president in who will try to reassure our allies. But that won't be so easy to do, because I think the world is also losing faith in America. I mean, the reason why America has been so successful is that not just because of our vast hard power, but because of our soft power, and because people have had faith in America as a force for good in the world. And Donald Trump is shattering that faith. He is saying we are out for ourselves, America first, screw the rest of you. And our allies know they really can't depend on us, because they understand that if the American political system could produce one Donald Trump, it can produce others. So how can you count on America for the long term? So, it's hard. I really see that Trump is accelerating the demise of the Pax Americana, the American-led world order. I don't know what will replace it. Possibly a Chinese-led world order. I think that's less likely than the alternative, which is a multipolar, fundamentally unstable, chaotic world, similar to the one that we last had prior to 1914.
I think what both political parties have done is that they haven't been able to attach this notion of an international world order and the benefits that flow to them to our own domestic prosperity, survival, and democracy. And I think that's why the Russian sabotage of our election becomes so vital. And it's obviously in many ways a huge missed opportunity. Because I think what responsible public leaders, public thinkers have to do is to explain the stakes in the world, which is not just geopolitical, it is ideological. We have the forces of liberal democracy, small l, and the forces of illiberal authoritarianism. And if we don't act in the international sphere in protection of those liberal values, we will not have the prosperity and the opportunity and the freedom that we have expected. So far from divorcing ourselves from the world, we have to make sure we sort of link arms, as you were saying, in order to protect ourselves. And whether it's the viability of our election system and faith in our election system, whether it is economic opportunity, because we are a very small portion of the world population-wise, so we depend upon world markets, whether it is technological advances in cooperation, our own fate depends upon us being integrated into the world and in some sense leaving the world. And we haven't been able to explain to people how those two things are connected. So they see it in their interest to pull back from the world, where in reality, we need to be leading the world. And that is going to help protect our democracy, help democracies flourish, help stability in the world, because democracies generally don't go to war with one another, and increase prosperity. And I think it's a hard argument to make when you have aroused an angry mob, as Pete, I think, correctly said, that is reacting simply viscerally and is enjoying a bully who's their bully, rather than understanding that his way of looking at the world is not only false, but it's really detrimental to their own well-being. And nothing could be more emblematic of this than the people in red America, farmers, who are experiencing record bankruptcies. And why is that? It's because we've gotten into trade wars with allies, and those people are suffering. What better example could there be of a failure of understanding of our place in the world and the prosperity of Americans than that? So I think that's the, if I were looking ahead, that's probably more than a presidential candidate would want to hear, but that's, I think, going forward what the challenge will be.
Well, let's talk about a lot of the questions that have come in are about the Republican Party and reacting to the, or asking us to elaborate on the original comments about that. So let me ask about that in the international relations context to Pete and Dana, who've been talked to a lot of Republican elected officials, obviously with Secretary Mattis. You must have been in a million meetings, and Pete's in touch with a lot of people on the Hill. I mean, I guess I would have said 3-4 years ago, I was pretty critical of President Obama's foreign policy, partly because it did involve some degree of U.S. withdrawal, he famously said when he announced the surge. And at the same time, the drawdown in Afghanistan, nation building begins at home. And I remember saying to someone in the Obama White House, who I knew at the time, I wish the president hadn't said that. It's going to come back to haunt you and us. And when people hear nation building begins at home, it's not going to be the happy, kind of liberal, cosmopolitan version of more modest internationalism, or whatever you want to call it, that Obama was for. It's going to end up being, I said at the time, Pat Buchanan, because he was the most recent exponent of that on the Republican side. I didn't anticipate Trump. Having said that, the Republican Party, I've got to say, through the Obama years, supported free trade, supported President Obama on free trade when a majority of Democrats in the House and Senate opposed him on this fast track, or whatever that's now called, the trade authority legislation. A majority of Republicans supported the intelligence community when tools they thought necessary. Again, when there were a lot of Democratic defections, they supported the surge of troops to Afghanistan, despite doubts about President Obama's commander-in-chief and so forth. And I guess I am pretty struck on the Republican side by, they were tougher on Russia than President Trump in the first 2 years, and I think they loved people they felt reassured having Jim Mattis and H.R. McMaster and others in there, but the degree of just quiet, maybe, rather than cheerleading on this issue for the president. I'm just curious what you two think. Where are the Republican elected officials? The public, I don't know. They've always been, honestly, even in the Cold War years, somewhat, defer to their leaders on foreign policy, typically, assuming that they know more in detail than the public does, and or maybe that won't happen anymore either. I'm just curious what you all find as you talk to elected officials.
My thought is the Republican Party, most elected officials are afraid. They're just scared of Trump. They're afraid of contradicting him publicly, obviously. I think there's a lot of energy put into trying to shape the president's opinions and thoughts privately. But at the end of the day, I worked for Senator McCain. We don't have a Senator McCain. So I think that is perhaps the greatest problem, is that you don't have a Republican Party that feels courageous enough to counter the president's ideas or to help shape his ideas. And that has a lot to do with his style, the way he goes after, he's scorched earth, right? But I think that will prove more detrimental to the party long term, is because we are supposed to, the Republican Party, I feel, we are a party of lots of ideas, and we fight it out and we move forward. And right now, you just don't have that kind of courage in the party right now.
Yeah, and just very quickly, I agree. And as I said before, I think it's primarily a lack of courage. I had breakfast with a fairly high-ranking person in the Trump administration yesterday morning, I guess, and he made an interesting observation. Before literally looking around and making sure nobody was there to hear him when he told me this, but
everybody keep it quiet, please.
Yeah, this is off the record. Those on the live stream, this is off the record, right?
Yeah. Well, I won't name who it was, but he actually made an interesting observation, which I think is apropos this conversation. He talked about almost the suffocating effects of Trump, and to some extent, we won't know what the Republican Party is like until Trump leaves. Because I think for the reasons we've discussed, he is an overwhelming force, and they're afraid of him. I suspect what's happened in my own conversations with Republicans is there's some degree of intellectual incoherence in international affairs. I don't think that they are Buchanan-like, and I don't think they're committed isolationists. I think that there has been a loss of confidence and faith in the traditional American international, or at least the post-World War II international order. And the confidence that attached itself to Bill when you and I were kind of coming up, and many of us were products of the Reagan Revolution. It was this deep confidence in American leadership and the ideals of American leadership and human rights. I mean, that is gone. So I think right now, I think that the Republican Party and people in Congress are uncertain about what they think about a whole host of things. And on top of that, they're afraid of what the base is like and what Trump is like. I'll say one other thing, which I think a lot of these issues, which once characterized the Republican Party and conservatism, suffered from a failure to articulate the reasons we believe what we believe. I think this is almost a time, in some respects, for remedial education in a whole realm of areas: international affairs, the role of character in the citizenry, why free markets are good things rather than not. And I think this happens in movements for a while. They assume that these arguments, they're taken for granted, and you no longer explain to a new generation why they matter. And so what happens is, for some period of time, these things become talking points, and then somebody comes in and just blows the house down, and all of a sudden you find out that there isn't actually anything there. So I do think that in the longer term, that those of us who are conservative need to figure out how to engage in this remedial education, but we have to find the people and the story to tell it. You have to ultimately, in politics, you have to touch people's hearts and their moral imaginations. You have to give them reason to believe. There's a great line in one of Wordsworth's poems, The Prelude, where he says, "What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how." And I think that is actually some of what politics is about too. You have to love the right things, and then you have to explain to people why those things are worthy of their love and their affection, and ultimately their defense.
Max wanted to say a word here, and then Jen, and each 1 minute each, though. So
I mean, I agree with everything Pete is saying, but I would add one other thing, which is I think that the Republican Party has become increasingly compromised morally and intellectually by their acquiescence to Trump. And they have basically become complicit in the crimes of Donald Trump, and in many cases, actual literal crimes, because they are aiding his obstruction of justice. Devin Nunes is the head of the House Obstruction of Justice Caucus, basically, but he has a lot of support on the right, and they are trashing the FBI, they are attacking the Justice Department, they are undermining Bob Mueller, who is an American hero, and they have become, because of their blind partisanship, their blind loyalty to Donald Trump, they are not only compromising their previous beliefs, for example, support of law enforcement or support of free trade or fiscal responsibility or support of family values, but they are basically compromising their very character. And it is very hard for me to see how we get out of this with the current crop of Republican leaders, because I used to have faith and trust in some of these people. I no longer do. I mean, it's been such a disillusioning experience to see the way that people like Paul Ryan or Marco Rubio or others, for whom I had respect in the past, the way they have behaved, so shamefully behaved in the current era. And there's almost so few Republicans who are uncontaminated, uncompromised by Trump. I mean, one of the few actually happens to be the governor of this great state of Maryland, but there are very few. You can basically count them on one hand.
Jen, last word. You get.
I think Pete's exactly right. I think what we have is a values crisis, and in terms of civic virtue, that the far right, and particularly the evangelical conservatives, became entirely corrupted and have chosen power and chosen enabling and chose to turn their back on character and every quality that we expect in leadership. And there's a void right now. I think people don't like that. I think fundamentally people want to be inspired. They want to think of their president as, in some sense, an example. How many Americans now say that they don't consider the president to be a role model? It's like 75%. You do wonder about the 25% of those parents who think he's a great role model. But besides that, and I think it may not come from the Republican Party. It may come from an idealistic, centrist Democrat or even a left Democrat. You have to begin to talk the language of values. John Kasich is another one who does this very well, of empathy, of self-control, of self-reliance, but with kindness, of community. And those basic foundational values have been lost. And I think the party or the person that's able to reestablish that will, I think, be greeted with a tremendous amount of relief, frankly.
We should close, but I'll just say two things for the audience, since we are here in Maryland, and I actually saw Governor Hogan about 3 weeks ago in Annapolis down the road. I think any of you, if you feel this is right, the Maryland residents should, once he gets through the legislative session here, reassure him that you won't hold it against him if he makes occasional visits to New Hampshire and Iowa to check out the possibility of saving the Republican Party, which would be a good thing for a Maryland governor to do. And he'll continue to be an excellent governor of your state. Those of you who are associated with Johns Hopkins, feel free to call Mike Bloomberg and tell him that he could always still come to the rescue a little later if we end up with an unacceptable choice of the two parties. So, but I don't know if either of those will happen. And I guess all of our records as forecasters are so bad now that who knows what's going to happen. But I do want to thank our panelists for really a terrific discussion, and thank all of you for coming, and thank the organizers of this conference for really a terrific series of panels. Thanks. Okay.
Okay, we're going to continue so we can stay on schedule. I would like to welcome to the stage our third panel for the morning. This is going to be a panel on discourse on free speech. All of our panels this morning are picking up on similar themes, talking about issues on the left and the right, both globally and here nationally in the United States. And the issue of free speech is one that comes up frequently on college campuses, as well as throughout our country. And so I'd like to welcome now Stephen David, the professor of political science here at Johns Hopkins University, who will be our moderator. He will be joined by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and Jonathan Haidt, professor of ethical leadership at the New York University Stern School of Business. I will remind everyone again that this panel, along with all of our panel discussions, is being put on in the spirit of inclusion and engagement and discourse. We will once again have an opportunity at the end of the panel for audience questions, so make sure to reference the screens. I know y'all are tired of me saying this, but on either side of the stage that has the URL to which you can submit your questions, and then Professor David will read those out during the last 15 to 20 minutes of the conversation. And so at this point, I would like to turn the panel over to Stephen and to say thank you to all of you for being here.
Okay, I know people are still filing in, but we're going to get started. It's wonderful to be in this holy place. We have two tremendous panelists and a panel on freedom of speech, which I think will be very exciting and all too relevant today. We have Ayaan, who is a courageous defender of human rights, and Jonathan Haidt, who has written widely and spoken widely about how people with moral differences can still get along. We'll have to wait and see if that works in this country. I've asked each of the panelists to provide a brief opening statement, and then we'll continue the discussion. Jonathan, do you want to begin?
Sure, yeah, I'll begin. So I'm a professor at NYU, and I co-founded an organization called Heterodox Academy, which advocates for viewpoint diversity in the academy. So I'll give a kind of a report from the front lines of what's going on campus. Our focus here is free speech on college campuses and its importance for the intellectual life of the country, and therefore also for democracy. So the situation on campus is a complete mess. Each side is absolutely convinced that it's right, and it is right. So people on the right, there's not many faculty on the right, but there are a lot of students on the right on almost all campuses. They are completely convinced that they are the victims of an oppressive, politically correct, numerically dominant left wing, and they have the videos to prove it. Videos of crazy left-wing students shouted down speakers, of people ripping up the signs of college Republicans who try to simply hold up a sign, of people punching conservatives in the face. The videos go all over. Everyone is completely convinced that they are the victims, and they are right. And on the left, they think that they're surrounded by hate speech, and they are right in the sense that there are videos of Nazis marching in Charlottesville. Nazis often march for free speech. I mean, it really does not help the cause when you've got Nazis marching for free speech, and there are videos to prove it. And when Donald Trump is going to put out an executive order for free speech. So the idea that progressive causes and inclusion are diametrically opposed to free speech is not a crazy idea. It's an unfortunate idea, but it's one that people on the left on campus can defend and say this is the way things are. So it's a complete mess. Both sides have a lot of evidence, including a lot of video evidence, that they are correct and they are the victims. What I'd like to do now is put forth a simple concept, a single word that can clarify things a lot. And it's wonderful that here we are. I guess the whole event is funded by the Niarchos Foundation. So it's a Greek word. The word is telos, T-E-L-O-S. It's a word you may remember if you took freshman philosophy. Aristotle urged us to analyze things in terms of what is its telos, or purpose. The telos of a physician is to heal. The telos of a university is to find truth and pass it on. So never, ever take part in a conversation about whether we should have free speech or hate speech. Just don't do that. It's a complete waste of time. Instead, say, what institution are we talking about, and what does its telos? So if we're talking about a corporation, should there be free speech in a corporation? No. The purpose is to work together to create some good or service. It's not about free speech. What about in Congress? Should there be free speech? Well, the purpose, a lot of purposes, but at some point they have to have language norms conducive to their telos, which is passing, whether you want to call it good legislation, or in some way, if Congress can't pass reasonable legislation, it has failed. So they have norms that do not require honesty. To be an effective politician, you do not need to have every statement be true. So their norms that are appropriate for Congress are not the norms appropriate for a company and are not the norms appropriate for university. In the public square, what is the telos? I don't know. I don't think there is one. So in the public square, it's perfectly appropriate to use ad hominem arguments, insults. There's not really anything that has to be accomplished. So the norms of speech in the public square are really quite nasty, and we see those all over the internet. Now, finally, let's come to the university. What do we need to do? If our telos is the discovery and passing on of truth, we have both a research function and an education function, then what we must have is a commitment to the highest level of truth and honesty. Our statements must be true. We must not even exaggerate. We hold each other to standards of literal truth, and we must have institutionalized disconfirmation. That means that anything I say, it's not that you should trust me because I'm so smart. It's that anything I say will be challenged by people who don't share my confirmation bias. They don't start with the same imperatives, the same beliefs. So if a university has viewpoint diversity, and we all know that anything that we say will be challenged by people who don't want us to be right, then you can trust the product of what comes out, because it's been through a vetting process unlike anything anywhere else in society, except maybe a good intelligence agency or something. So if you keep your focus on the discovery and transmission of truth, now you can see what the problem is. When we have speech norms that interfere with our telos, we have a serious, serious problem. And the biggest problem we have on campus, I believe, is orthodoxy. That is, when there are blasphemy laws, and I mean that quite literally, when there are things you can say, studies you can point to, people you can cite, and you will be shamed and excluded for doing so. When people engage with you not by challenging your reasons, but by saying you're a bad person because you're associating with person X, those are the norms of the public square. Yeah. In the public square, you can shame people all you want. You can do ad hominem all day long. Those have no place in a university, but my God, are they there now. In fact, my book with Greg Lukianoff, The Coddling of the American Mind, came out in September. There's been almost no critique of it, just a lot of ad hominem arguments against us. So my point is, universities are amazing, magical, wonderful institutions to the extent that they bring people together in an environment with speech codes that bring the truth out. We now have a problem that people are so socially fearful that it doesn't work. To quote one student, at Claremont McKenna College, she said, "My motto is, silence is safer." This generation has kids born after 1995. They've had social media since middle school. I ask them over and over again. I do polls. Has it made you tougher? Has it made you say you don't care about being shamed? Or has it made you cowardly? Has it made you walk on eggshells? Has it made you fear to like anything because you're afraid of what people will do to you? And the vote is always 100% to 0%. It has made us more cowardly. So these are the norms that are now coming on campus. It's not the students' fault. They were raised with social media. We have to keep our focus on orthodoxy, and we need speech codes or speech norms that are conducive to our mission. Without those, we cannot address the biggest problems of our century. As we heard in the first panel, populism, liberalism, that was a wonderful panel. All these wonderful, helpful distinctions. But if we can't have open discussions about politically important topics, we will not solve the biggest problems of the 21st century.
Okay, thank you. Ayan.
Thank you, Jonathan. I wish I took your philosophy class. Last night, I had the privilege of sitting next to Professor Steve David. Oh. And what you asked me was, so tell me a little bit about your life, how did you grow up, etc. And we were able to say, okay, you said you were old enough to know when the dictator, Mohamed Siad Barre, was president of Somalia.
You aren't supposed to reveal that, but that's okay.
And I'll stop revealing the private components of this conversation and just say, when you asked me about my life history, I said, so my childhood was in tyranny, and what we have in Somalia now is anarchy. And Professor David asked me, which one do you prefer? And after a lot of hesitation, I said, I think, so when the tyranny was in place, that particular president is the one who sent my father to prison, and he killed a lot of my relatives. And so I have a special hatred for not just the individual who did that to me and my family, but also tyranny in general. But when you then ask me about, is anarchy better, I'll say, let me think about it. No, I don't think that anarchy is better. I don't think that the state of affairs in Somalia today is better than what it was in the 1970s and the 1980s. And in fact, a lot of people settle for tyranny because when it comes to order versus anarchy, I think most people who just want to get on with their lives settle for tyranny. And we're seeing versions of this in China. We're seeing it in many places in the Middle East. You remember the Arab Spring, or what should have been an Arab Spring. And I think some of these societies have decided, well, maybe tyranny wasn't that bad after all. I'm not there. I had the fortune to be actually introduced to democracies. I lived in the Netherlands. I traveled all over Europe. Now I'm in the United States living in a democracy. And like all of you, and like a lot of people who think that tyranny might be the best way to go forward, I see the weaknesses of democracy. We haven't come up as human beings with anything better. And I think what a democracy demands, if we want to sustain it more than anything else, is that we understand its vulnerabilities. And I just want to make 3 points about what I think is really important that we understand about a democracy. We don't want an anarchy. We don't want tyranny. We have the luxury of democracy, and I think of it as a luxury. I think a lot of these students are misbehaving because they have never really been introduced to any kind of threats. So the first thing I want to say is, in democracies, whether we are a republic as we are, or symbolic monarchic democracies that we have in Europe, majorities matter. We have elections, and the outcome of an election has consequences. Why do majorities matter? Because it is based on whatever majority of the day that then we have policies. And we really do need to think about that. And the second point is, if we want to hope for the majority to make a wise decision based on information, knowledge, and wisdom, we have to educate those citizens, those individuals. And that really is the point of our conversation. It is what universities do. What universities are supposed to do is teach the citizenry not what to think, but how to think. And if we fail at that, I'm afraid that we're either going to become a tyranny or an anarchy or something else, but definitely not a democracy. And the question then for us, and this is where I'm going to end, because I really don't think we have the time to solve all of these problems, is to say, maybe in our national conversation, let's shift away from the president of the day, from what is happening in DC, to what is happening on our campuses. Who are the people who are teaching our citizenry? In democracies, universities educate individuals to persuade. At least we assume that that's what we are trying to do, because you're not forced to do it. The dictator simply says, I want you to do this, and you do it. And he gets the police out. But we think that we are training a leadership to come out and persuade us. who are the people who are teaching, or in the dystopia that some of us fear, who are indoctrinating our children? The undergraduates, the graduate students, who are they? What exactly are they learning? As parents, I'm a parent now. I mean, I don't have a university. I do, actually. My stepchildren are, one of them is in university. But it's the kind of thing we think, who's teaching? And what is education? It's the most fashionable word. Any kind of problem, it all ends with, well, we need education. But what is education? It is a sense of direction, and who is giving that direction, and where are we taking things? And I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, well, thank you both. I mean, you're talking about a tyranny. You're talking about perhaps a left-wing bias in universities. Can you describe, either through your personal experiences or what you've surmised, as to whether or not there truly is a tyranny of the left on universities, where students who are conservative, Republican, heaven forbid, are not permitted to express their views, or are not comfortable in expressing their views?
Okay, sure, I'll take that because we've done a lot of survey work on this. First, I want to build, I'll get to the answer in part by building on what Ayan just said. When she started off by talking about tyranny versus anarchy, at first I thought, oh, maybe those would be good metaphors for what's going on campus. And I thought, well, no, it's not that crazy. It's not anywhere near that far.
Right.
And in a way, it's not. But let's connect it back to that wonderful panel we had, the first panel on populism. And we learned to distinguish the issue isn't democracy. That's easy. That's just elections. The issue is liberalism. And what I took away from that is, if you don't have rule of law and protection for minorities and minority views, you don't have a liberal society. And I think that's very helpful for thinking about what's happening at universities.
But how do you get that in universities? Are you talking about developing special, you talked about speech codes. Do you need to ensure this in terms of a legal code for universities?
So I think you need, what it calls us to do is to focus on process. And so, for example, in scholarly publication, we have peer review. And if somebody tries to corrupt it by buying publication, that would be corruption.
Yeah.
In discussions, in a seminar class, somebody proposes something, people then feel free to critique it. So if we think about, there's a procedure for arriving at knowledge. And if we lose that, we cannot claim to be liberal in this sense. There's also got to be respect for minority views, minority opinions. Now, if people are being excluded because of their race or sexual orientation, we all agree that's horrible, and we all agree that has happened in the past. There has been silencing. There's been unbelievable progress now, to the point where when members of various groups identify themselves as marginalized, historically marginalized, of course they are.
Yes.
But to claim that you're marginalized now at NYU or any of these incredibly progressive institutions is to actually be self-marginalizing. Anyway, my larger point is, if we focus on having procedures for arriving at the truth and respect for minority views, minority doesn't necessarily mean race and gender. It actually, in the relevant sense, it actually means minority political views. The views we most need are the ones who will challenge the majority. And if we lose that sense, that conservative students in particular, but it turns out, our survey work shows that centrists and libertarians often feel they're much more like the conservatives in feeling like they're not free to speak. And so I think our focus on political science today actually does work pretty well for analyzing university situations.
Ayan, can you speak to this, and also speak to some of the personal experiences you've had in being shut down or threatened in trying to advance your views?
Yes, I will. But please, is it okay if I ask Jonathan to just please talk about that case where students were demanding detergents and fabric softness?
Yes.
Yeah. I really do think I'm looking at the room and I'm thinking for the average age, that kind of puts the problem on the table.
Yeah. So right now, as we speak, students at Sarah Lawrence College are, I think, in their 3rd or 4th day of occupying one of the faculty buildings. They've issued 90 demands to the president, and demand number 3 demand number 1 is free housing, at least over winter break, but free housing with no work requirement. And then demand number 3 is with free laundry facilities, including not just detergent, but fabric softener. and so here, I wrote a book. I co-wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. Yeah. And my co-author and I, we don't like to use the word coddling. The editors insisted on it. But if the students themselves are demanding fabric softener as their 3rd demand, and it's non-negotiable, these are not negotiable, these are not requests. So this is my point, is that there should be no role for intimidation on a college campus. They may well have concerns. They claim there's been no progress on race and racism at Sarah Lawrence in 50 years. I don't know if they're right. I imagine that there's been some progress. Yeah. But I'm sure they have some points. Yeah. Let them make their points. Yeah. On a college campus, the norms have to be never any threats. You win by persuasion. You win by marshaling evidence. You do not win by threatening, and especially students now are so adept at threatening social destruction and reputational destruction. And so this is why I think we see these cases. Let me be clear, this is not representative. Most students are fine. Most students want to learn. As I travel around the country and I speak about the book, what I find is that at the elite schools, especially in the Northeast, you have a huge call-out culture problem. Most students say they have call-out culture, not in all their classes, not in the sciences, but in some humanities and in the identity studies department. So let's not get carried away. It's not that the fascists or communists have taken over the university. Yeah. There are really terrible norms in a few predictable departments at most of our top universities. And at most of the second-level universities, it's not that big a deal. That would be my overall report.
Ayan.
So I want to get to the fabric softener student. Mm-hmm. I really do miss my grandmother because she wouldn't reason with them. She would say they need a thorough spanking. And that's exactly what they need. A thorough spanking. But then I think about that, and I think that level of authority where, I was raised in an environment where what your grandmother said, what the older people said, what the individuals in the places of authority did, you had to have deference for that, and you had to respect it. And I came to the conclusion, maybe I do need to blaspheme against that, because every single time you challenged their authority, they complained about blasphemy. So what is the good middle ground between, this absolute authority of, and I really do think they need a thorough spanking, I do. I think they need to be expelled and or sent to Africa or Afghanistan or some places where real problems are going on, so they don't need to invent problems. But there's that, you've got to obey, you've got to do as I say, and so on, versus the inmates takeover. I was exposed to it when I was at Harvard. I was there for 5 years at the Kennedy School. And I started a study group, and I wanted to study a phenomenon, which is, in my view, I did my master's degree in political science. I was fascinated by political philosophy. And I lived in the Netherlands, and I thought it's unlike any place I've ever been. I was in Somalia, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, wherever. And then I come to this little place the size of Rhode Island, 6 feet under sea level, and incredibly wealthy and well-ordered. And I just thought, it's fascinating. I want to understand how this came about. And that was where my fascination for political philosophy started. And I was educated in the University of Leiden, and in those years, between 1995 and 2000, in university, I learned how to think. And I think the service that the University of Leiden provided to its students went way beyond just what the white Dutch privileged kids had to go through, but to have someone like me come in and appreciate critical thinking and appreciate the idea that people have different ways of looking at the world and different prisms, and that we test them out. And that on an empirical level, some of these, we see these kids in the United States today who are fascinated by socialism, and you say, okay, well, you come to the conclusion they have not been educated. They really haven't gone through any kind of critical thinking, because if they did, they would understand that socialism is a bad idea that was tried over and over and over and over again. And whether it's tried in Asia or in Africa or in Latin America or wherever, the results are exactly the same. So what is it that universities are doing wrong that these students don't see that?
Well, I want to pick up on that. I mean, what are universities doing wrong, and what can universities do to ensure not a total balance, but some balance?
Yeah.
I mean, even at Johns Hopkins, which I think is a lot better than most places, if you look at speaker series and such, it's pretty much the left to the far left.
Yeah.
And this is called, diverse opinions. Faculty and administrators don't want to step in and tell students, no, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. What can be done to ensure, again, a true dialogue of people from different views?
Tell them from the minute they come in, stop talking about your feelings and your emotions and your prejudices and whatever it is that you can. You come in and you're expected to think. In other words, you're going to be exposed to ideas that will disturb you, that will alarm you, that will shock you. That's the whole point.
So your office doesn't have a safe space sticker, I assume.
No.
Just guessing.
I think I'm going to bring a little racket and tell them, yeah, spank you.
Okay, Jonathan, did you?
So building on what Ayan said, first let me say I don't agree that they literally need a spanking, and I assume you meant that metaphorically, not physically. What they need, But what they need, I can go beyond what Ayan said. It's not just that they need to be explained that this is what's going to happen. What is most needed, is good, clear, consistent leadership from the moment they come in, where the leader defines, what are we doing here? What is our telos? Why are we together? What is special about this place? And this is what we see across the country as we've analyzed many of the situations where there have been meltdowns, a complete failure of leadership. And so,
a failure of leadership by whom?
So by the university president. So let's look at two examples. Evergreen State College was one of the most spectacular meltdowns. The president there allowed himself to be humiliated. He never pushed back. He was afraid of his students. You can see it in the videos. They humiliated him. They kept him prisoner. They said he couldn't go to the bathroom. They ordered him to put his hands down, stop gesticulating. He put his hands down. So he completely capitulated, and he let them define one of the most progressive schools in the country as an inherently deeply racist place that needs to be completely reformed by the students. So if you let go, if you don't say, so the norms of the public square will flood in. We are in a time of a kind of a moral anarchy.
So if you were the president of Evergreen College, what would you have done?
I would have done just what the president of Oberlin did. So Oberlin is another school which is extremely far left. We assume it is full of radical students, radical politics. And so when the students there occupied the president's office, and they came to him with their demands, their ultimatums, you have a week to answer, and he said, no. You come in here, you give me an ultimatum, you criticize and slander members of my staff. This is completely unjust. This is not the way we do things. My office door is open too. If you want to come see me next week, come see me next week. But if you're giving me an ultimatum, the answer is no. And so they left.
Okay.
So moral leadership, defining what we're doing, and then sticking to it. And what we're seeing at Sarah Lawrence, I believe, is that the president is, as many presidents are, terrified of her students and is not disputing their narrative. I think she's going to negotiate. Probably she'll give them the detergent, but not the fabric softener.
Okay, Ayan. Yes.
So,
why are people terrified of students? I mean, what is the, Ayan, do you want to respond to that?
I think it's
are you
a crisis
terrified
of
of the
authority.
students you teach?
I'm not terrified of students.
Okay, good.
I think we have, it is really literally a crisis of authority.
Yes.
And you described Oberlin. So in my experience at Harvard, the two grown-ups in the room, the dean and the president of Kennedy School, they explained to the students who were trying to get me out. So in my experience, I would
When you say get me out, what do you mean?
So I start a study group. I'm not grading students or anything. It's voluntary. It's for graduate students. You can come if you want. You sign up for it. You don't have to come. But at some point, I found a number of students who said they speak for all Muslims, that I was Islamophobic, that they were distressed, and that the students who would be exposed to me would then have all kinds of emotion. They would have PTSD. I know, it's like you have to say something like that to me. So they went on and they started writing letters and they petitioned, and then I was sent to the diversity officer, and I was a racist, and the poor woman had no idea what to talk to me about because I'm black and I'm female, and she wasn't raised to think that that's a problem. A white male would be the problem. So we went through all of these comical stuff, and at some point they demanded that an imam sit in on my class. But the comedian part of it was these students didn't have to come. You only came if you. I wasn't grading. It wasn't. It's not like
it's voluntary.
Classical. So that's my experience, and I remember going through the whole procedure and thinking, okay, what are we going to do about it? But it was right after Brandeis. I was in. The president of Brandeis, the former president of Brandeis, said to me, "Would like to give you an honorary degree," and I said, "Wonderful! I'm so humbled and privileged. I'm going to come and get it. Thank you very much." And then 3 or 4 days before the event, he said, "Well, there are all these masses and masses of problems, and we're going to retract the invitation. You're not going to get it." And he explained. I just remember thinking, "You're giving in. This is such a crisis. You are the president.
That's exactly.
You should put a stop to it."
It's a violation of procedure. We need rule of law. We need procedures for doing things, and not have room for loud factions to say, "No, we insist that this is how it's going to be."
It's exactly that. It is my 7-year-old demanding that he's going to play Minecraft until midnight. and you have that confrontation. It is, "No, darling, you're not." And right now, I'm the winner. And I intend to keep it that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jonathan, did you want?
Yes. So I think Ion really put her finger on it. There's a term you sometimes hear called aphobophobia, which means on campuses we all live in constant fear of being called Islamophobic, transphobic, homophobic, something phobic. We all live, we're a very progressive community. We really care about diversity and inclusion. And so everything we do is done with, like, if I do this or say this, will I be called something, will I be sent to the diversity office? In my university, as at many universities, there's a sign in every bathroom telling students how to report me if I say something that offends them. And so even though I won't be, I've got tenure, I'm not going to be fired, but I'm really, really busy. And so if I'm going to get dragged into, it takes weeks and meetings and email, if I'm going to get dragged into something, and then my reputation will be slandered. So it's better, just silence is safer. I don't talk about controversial issues anymore. I don't talk about gender differences when they're relevant. I don't talk about anything that could set off a student, because the university has put in place institutional supports for anyone. So, and you know, who is this helping? You're training students who are members of identity groups. You're training them. Basically, you know, this just blows my mind. You know, Demosthenes had a speech impediment, so he trained by putting pebbles in his mouth, so that when he took them out, he could speak better. He trained by running up hills, so that when he would give his oration at the top, he could speak more. So that's how you train people. Instead, what we do in universities is we give them the safest possible environment. We sweep it clean of anything. We prepare them for a world in which if they are offended, they have bureaucratic means to punish the offender. And then we send them out into the world where the normal world, a normal, progressive, progressive company with good values is going to be intolerable to them.
Well, and that doesn't help minorities. So look at the groups that, you know, in the victim matrix that you described, the people who are supposed to be the most victimized, people of color, POCs, women, trans people, whatever. You want to lift individuals from these communities up. What do? You expose them to the best ideas. You expose them to resilience, critical thinking. You teach them how to get ahead. That is one way of doing it. If you, as a university, as an institution, or you create these safe spaces and give them Play-Doh and cookies, and this is what is given in these safe spaces. So you infantilize them, and then you have to ask yourself, as the university bureaucracy, the president, the administrators, the donors, all of these people, what exactly are we doing for these minorities? Are we lifting them up, or are we infantilizing them?
Good intentions often backfire.
Well, good intentions, and the outcome is racism, it is sexism. Because as a person of color, what would lift me out of my poverty and my backwardness and whatever challenge it is that I'm facing, would it be to be exposed to Plato and Shakespeare and Karl Popper, or would it be to give me chocolate chip cookies and cotton wool and
let me push back a little. I mean, clearly we need more diversity of opinions, and we are infantilizing students, et cetera. But students do come to campuses, especially students from groups who feel marginalized. Feel marginalized, and maybe in some cases are marginalized. Having a diversity office, having a community that is supportive, can give them the foundation perhaps to learn more, to be more comfortable. I mean, is all this junk? I mean, is diversity officers, should we just get rid of all this and simply say everyone has to be strong and fight and let the good ideas win out? Or can we do something to make students who traditionally haven't been at colleges, who are frightened, upset, concerned, can we do something to make them feel comfortable in this environment?
I think Jonathan is just this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful man, and he's going to give you an answer in a way, that is supposed to get everyone along. But if I had any kind of authority or power, there would be no diversity officers or officers. All these departments that study these. Just indulge in these narcissistic things. The Department of Studying Blacks and Women and Chicane, all of that would be closed. There would be none of that. The university would be a place where you actually send students and you select them. Are they capable of being open to learning how to think? And that is what you would teach. And the rest of it is coddling of the kids that would be left out. But that is, I don't have that authority.
So my answer would be, let's stick to our telos, and let's make this an empirical question. Let's study what works. And we don't do that. There are some studies on some of these things, and mostly they show either that it backfires or it does nothing. So it might seem, well, we should have more ethnic identity centers. The only study I know of that tracked students at UCLA found that participation in ethnic identity centers makes them feel more angry, to see more the world as a battle between good and evil and groups locked in combat. It does not lead to a sense of inclusion or trust. Same thing with
let me ask,
diversity.
would you follow IN's recommendations, get rid of diversity offices, ethnic study departments, and all this?
They are generally the locus of the problems, but I don't know if you can really get rid of them. Certainly the areas of scholarship you cannot get rid of. You need that scholarship. Now, whether they should be in separate departments or integrated into history or sociology, that's an interesting question.
So what is their scholarship? What exactly do they...
Well, I do think
what do we
that,
learn?
Well, certainly to emphasize more the role of women in history that have been understudied, that should be done in the history department. So let's not get into the question of what, the key question is, are they activists or scholars? And there we probably agree about the nature of the problem. But what I really want to insist on is that we need to start taking an empirical approach, because you look at the list of demands that they gave at Sarah Lawrence, it's identical to or very similar to the demands made by students at 80 universities in 2015, 2016. They asked for the same 5 or 10 sets of things. As far as I know, there is no harmony at the end of the rainbow. That is, I have never seen a university, a company, anything that went down this path, and then after several years, things were better. I don't know of such a case. And so if we have a set of prescriptions that are ideologically motivated, that are motivated by anger, and that are not based on empirical research, I don't think any institution should adopt them unless you can show evidence that this will make things better. And they generally make things worse, I believe.
We only have a couple of minutes. Let me ask, do you think things are getting better, getting worse? Where are things going? Some audience questions also. Okay. But go ahead.
Very briefly, I think nationally in our country, things are getting a lot worse on a lot of these fronts. But on universities, within a particular institution, some things are getting better. There is better leadership now. The presidents were all caught unawares in 2015. Now more are saying, now wait a second, no. So I think that the shout downs, a lot of things are declining. The sense of call-out culture, the sense of walking on eggshells, however, that I think is increasing. And that's what most alarms me.
Let me just give a couple of audience questions. If you can answer these very quickly, that would be good. Who is responsible for drawing the line between freedom of speech and political correctness? How can we make sure these standards are upheld today in today's digital world? If we could have quick responses to that. Ayan, do you want to begin?
Well, I'll say if I sign up to go to an institution called a university, then the president and the administrators of that university, the professors, they are responsible for the curriculum, and they should be held responsible for that curriculum. And if they're taking all this money and they're producing students who are indoctrinated instead of educated, then I think they should be liable for that. And we're also seeing a spillover. So some of the insanities that you describe, to me it's an insanity, some of the insanities you describe in what's going on campuses is spilling over, as you can see, into the rest of society. I watched that spectacle of the nomination of a Supreme Court justice, and I remember all these mobs demonstrating and scratching the Supreme Court wall and just going completely crazy and saying, I believe, I believe, I believe. And that takes us back to, the core of what does this all mean for a democracy. If that's the kind of people we're going to produce, the kind of leadership, these people who say presumption of innocence, all of these norms and values that make a democracy distinct and different from an anarchy or a tyranny, and they're behaving in this way and it's completely voluntary, then I think these universities are doing something wrong and terribly, terribly wrong. Are things getting better? I think in some ways they are, because we are talking openly about the problem. But it is going to take a little bit of time before we get to a different place here.
Another quick audience question. Can you think of examples of where open-minded acceptance of divergent views has worked? Universities that are following a good example that others should follow?
Yes, at Heterodox Academy, Deb Mashik is the executive director. She's been doing a listening tour. She's been talking with presidents all over the country. I've met with a number of presidents, including President Daniels, came to talk to me when they were planning out the whole Agora project. And so I think Johns Hopkins is a great example. There's a deliberate attempt to bring a diversity of views together and to create a center responding to an urgent national need. St. John's, where they read the great books, they really they do a great job of having an academic culture that welcomes viewpoint diversity, because their goal is to understand great ideas. As Ayan was saying, this is a way to lift people up. There are a number of schools that really are doing a good job. We have Deb Mashik and I have an article coming out in Reason very soon, where we list 10 schools that we think are doing a good job. So we're going to try to recognize there are a lot of great presidents out there who are trying, often against great odds, to broaden the spectrum of opinion, and some are being successful.
Okay, just to wrap things up, and I really need a quick answer on this.
Okay.
Why is this happening on college universities? Why is so much of the discourse skewing to the left?
Okay.
In universities that, again, are supposed to promote free inquiry and different opinions, why is it so biased?
In our book, we go through 6 different causal threads. I won't do all 6 here.
Do all 6.
But just imagine that the faculty is shifting to the left. Our country is purifying. A lot of institutions are purifying. That's not necessarily bad, but now have that happen in the middle of a culture war where left and right increasingly hate each other. And while that's happening at the university level, imagine that the students who arrived in the fall of 2013 are the first wave of Gen Z, born in 1995. The first kids who got social media in middle school. It turned them into more fearful and anxious people who were raised with social media too early. They bring in call-out culture, much higher rates of anxiety and depression. You have all these things coming together in 2013, 2014, and boom, things go up in smoke.
Okay, thank you. Ayan, you have the last word.
I think a lot of it has to do with affluence.
That's right.
We've no real threats. We're very comfortable. You have, I think, Jonathan, you did talk about it, and David Brooks has written a little bit about it, and it is kids who are raised, all these safety measures, the surfaces are made softer.
Fabric softeners, universal now,
yeah. Fabric softeners.
We need rough clothing, rough diapers, that'll solve the problem.
Yeah. So we don't have real problems. You have women going around in the United States of America claiming that they're victims and that they're the circumstances are worse than those of the women in Afghanistan. And I would say maybe a part of the curriculum should be that we take some of these young people to those parts of the world where there are real problems. Let them be there for a few weeks, 3 months, so on, and then come back, and I think we'll sing a different tune.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the fact that you all can speak this way at Johns Hopkins is a sign of hope. Thank you very much for your remarks. Thank you.
Okay, we are about to start our final panel of the morning. We've had a great opportunity to hear from a discussion on populism, on what's going on the right, free speech, and now we are going to hear for our fourth panel of this morning about what is going on the left and discourse about the issues that are facing that movement. Today's panel will be moderated by Yamiche Alcindor, White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. So pleased to have you here, and so pleased to be working again with PBS. We are also joined by Donna Brazil, former interim chair of the DNC, and Richard North Patterson, a columnist and former chair of Common Cause. Thank you all so much for being here. And one last reminder, as always, in the spirit of inclusive engagement and discourse, we want to make sure all of our panelists feel respected, and to remind you that once again you will have an opportunity in the last 15 minutes or so of this panel for audience questions, and the URL is on the screens, so you can submit those. And at this point, I would like to turn it over to Yamiche.
Great.
Thank you.
Can you all hear me? Great. Thank you so much for joining us and for attending this panel. As I pose my questions, please do be sending in your own questions, because around 15 minutes in, I'm going to go to that iPad and I don't want it to be empty. So thank you so much, both of you, for having this spirited conversation. A quick thing, I had a quick phone call right before this panel to just kind of chew things over, and I almost wanted to record it because it was so interesting already. So the first thing I'm going to ask you both, Richard and Donna, is, and I want to say Professor Brazil because she's my professor at Georgetown, but we'll try to go with Donna.
She got a good grade, by the way.
There's a discussion going on in the Democratic Party about whether or not AOC and Representative Omar, which is really the new face of the party, whether or not that progressive-leaning part of the party is where the party should be heading, or if there should be some sort of a pivot to the middle, or even thinking about someone like Katie Hill, who won in a Trump district. Is there any danger, do you think, to the party going too far to the left?
Yes, I do. I think litmus tests are popular until people know the details. So the Green New Deal, for example, sounds great. We're all terribly concerned about the moral urgency of the environment, but it's a Christmas tree with lots of things that don't relate to the environment. It's so easy to criticize. Medicare for all sounds great until people who have health insurance alike realize they wouldn't keep it under the all government format. Abolish ICE. I don't even know what that means as policy, but as purple state electoral politics, it's really crack smoking lunacy. It just makes no sense. I think AOC has brought a lot of energy and enthusiasm. I think it's fine. She's helping drive the debate on issues. But the Democrats won in 2018 with a lot of moderate candidates as well, and by carrying suburban districts as well. And it's a false choice, I think, to say, you know, we don't care about white voters in the Midwest, but we do care about our base, or vice versa. The truth is that to win and then to govern, they're going to need to pitch as broad a tent as possible. They certainly need to address progressive issues and the rise of inequality, and also what I think is falsely labeled identity politics, where some people have actually had identity thrust on them, and they do need social justice. But if the Democrats don't have a broad economic-based message of enriching America and tapping into the resources of all of our people, then I think they're in trouble.
What do you make of that, Donna?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, great to be in Baltimore, and I just saw my good friend, the Honorable Barbara Mikulski, arrive here, so it's good to be here in her beloved state and hometown. What we saw in 2016 was massive disruption in both political parties. On the left, we saw an anti-establishment candidate gain a large foothold in the conversation and the debate and discussion that we had inside the party. One could characterize the disruption that we saw on the left is also a disruption we saw on the right, trade being one of those issues. I think in the aftermath of both 9/11 and as well as the Great Recession, what you're experiencing in both parties is somewhat of a, I like to call it economic insecurity, national insecurity. People are feeling a great desire to have a conversation about these topics. And with an open primary and an open field on the Democratic side, there's no question that we're going to have a dialogue about issues that may not have risen to the top of say, our political agenda in the previous 2 election cycles. I think it's healthy. It's healthy that we have a party that can both represent the values and views of say, an AOC, as well as the values and views of governors like my own home state governor, who's a moderate up for re-election in the great state of Louisiana. He's a pro-life, pro-gun Democrat that his first act was to improve, expand Medicaid in my great state. So we're a big tent party with moderates, with liberals, maybe a few conservatives, not as many when I was growing up. But, you know, it's a healthy, I think it's a healthy dialogue that we're having within the Democratic Party, whether it's on the Green New Deals or Medicare for all. You know, Rick, you don't mind if I call you Rick? No. Thank you, boo. You know what's healthy is that I had an opportunity to be on TV a couple of weeks ago, and I started talking about Medicare for all. And I was talking about Medicare for all, the Canadian model, the Australian model, and I'm like, what the hell am I talking about? I'm talking about models from all these other countries. And because we're having this conversation now. And the American people, and I also think our voters, would like us to have this conversation. I watched Beto this morning. You know, Beto announced today. He's like Oprah and Obama. We're going to call him by his first name. I watched him in the span of 15 minutes in Keokuk hour. He answered 19 questions, 19. And they range from everything from tariffs to the opioid epidemic. If we can't have this conversation during a Democratic primary, when are we going to have this conversation? I want us to get it out of our system. I want us to have a conversation. And I don't care if you label us as socialists. Nobody's talking about government control of, you know, state enterprises or government control of the private sector. But we got to have these conversations. And I understand it's painful to have people, you know, talk in 50-second sound bites and not 15-second sound bites. But if not now, when? And if not the leaders who are running, then who? We got to have these conversations. And it's going to be painful. Reparations, let's have it. Let's have the tough conversations. We're Democrats, we can handle it. And if we can't handle it in this season, then God forbid, we will lose, because there will be a lot of people who will say this party stands for nothing. This party is not leading the change we wish to see. So I want to see it in the Democratic Party. I want to see it, you know, I want to see it in the primaries. And after the primary is over with, I hope we can bring the party together. That's all I'm saying. And I know a little bit about this because I've had 30 years, and this is not Miss Clairol. 30 years in the trenches. And I want to see a young generation get a chance to have a seat at the table. And I don't care if it's AOC, I don't care if it's Lauren Underwood, I don't care if it's Ayanna Pressley. Let's have this conversation. This is the time to do it.
As you talk about that and you talk about the dialogue that's going on in the Democratic Party, I was talking to a source just yesterday about the term socialism. And I was told that there are going to be people in the Democratic Party that are really going to try to focus more on the Democratic side and focus more on the idea of catching independence and don't want to use the term socialism. What do you make of that? And what do you think about that specific term socialism?
Well, it's generational, I think, to some extent. I mean, it still doesn't, socialism as a concept still doesn't poll well. And it's clear that Trump is going to say socialist, 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 so he's blue in the face. That will work only if Democrats can't compose themselves in some unified way behind a progressive message which says, you know, we're all for the free market. We want a free market that's truly free, which reverses income inequality, which addresses the flow of wealth upwards, which addresses the problems of the outsized influence of the wealthy on our politics. I mean, I think all those things can be spoken to in a very important way. I note that younger people do not have the same aversion to the word socialist because, you know, the economy really hasn't worked for them so well. And in their historic memory, the last 20, 30 years, we've had rising inequities. and a drift toward what can be arguably called plutocracy.
So Donna, if you're campaign manager for one of the 12 to 15 to 35 Democrats that are running, whatever the number is today, do you tell your candidate to use the term socialism, or do you tell your candidate whatever you do, don't use it, don't put it in commercials, don't put it on Facebook ads?
The only person who self-identifies in the Democratic field today as a Democratic socialist is Bernie Sanders. So I'm going to leave it to Bernie Sanders to define himself, define his values, but I think the other candidates need to define who they are. And I understand that President Trump is going to inject himself, he's going to give various candidates nicknames, he's going to do everything he can to cause disarray within a party that is going to be hard at it in terms of getting itself a nominee. But I believe that the most important thing is, as Rick just said, is to talk about the fact that our economic order needs guardrails. We need a fair tax system. We need to talk about it in terms of fairness so that the middle class and the working poor can believe in us again. You know, the biggest misnomer in politics today is that the majority of voters are not Democrats, they're not Republicans. They're independent. And whether we like to say it or not, the reason why we're having problems in both political parties is because in primary elections, less than 12% of the American people are showing up. We have a crisis in confidence in our political parties because we have two major political parties, but we have four different political ideologies that are basically tearing these parties apart. You have the libertarians on the right, and you have the populists or the leftists inside the Democratic Party. I don't want to see our party torn apart. I think we can bring our party together with those simple values that make us Democrats, that make us Americans. And if we don't have that way of framing our conversation and our issues, we're going to lose the middle, and we need the middle in order to win. And I say the middle, I know many of my leftist friends and progressive friends don't like me saying that, but I am from Louisiana. I take my politics seriously. But when I was down there several times trying to help Mary Landrieu get reelected, somebody who could represent all of us, all of our various values, you know what? They kept putting these purist litmus tests, and she had to check every damn box, including on the environment, and I kept saying, this is a petrochemical state. Hell, we got 4 seasons, shrimp, crab, crawfish, and oysters, but they coexist with our oil and gas industry. And so Mary has to represent all of this. And yet, we found it difficult during election seasons to bring Democrats together because they felt that she had to be a purist on all of these multiple issues. I want to have candidates who can cross over and get those who are so-called independent, at the same time keep our Democratic base or keep our Democratic base intact.
In poll after poll, Democrats say the #1 issue on their minds is electability. Translation, they want someone who can beat Donald Trump. What do you think the Democrats should be thinking as they think about beating Donald Trump? Should they ignore the nicknames that he gives, or should they be blunt? Should they go after him hard and give him his own nickname?
You know, to me, I think the Democratic nominee, whoever he or she is, has to run with passion and has to run with grace. I think people are tired of the negativism. In any event, you can't beat Trump at that game. He's a natural. So I think you deplore his lack of decorum, but you campaign on his issues, and in particular his betrayal of the very people that he said that he was going to help, which are, among other things, you know, the people who've been falling behind. If you look at the tax bill, that thing is a Christmas tree for the rich. It's going to leave future generations with a yawning deficit. If you look at the environment, if you look at what they're doing to education, on every issue they're betraying Americans, and particularly betraying the people that Trump wanted to help. So I think you campaign against him as a phony populist, but primarily on the issues, what he's done, and not on personality. And I mean, we saw what happened to Marco Rubio when he tried that. I just don't think you win that game.
Hope and change has always been part of my game, so I like it. But at the same time, there are too many of our fellow citizens who live on the outskirts of hope, and if we don't find a way to broaden the circle of opportunity, to bring them in, to make them feel like they're part of something that will give them a life, will give them an ability to thrive. That is what we Democrats always stood for. We've always stood for things that made this country strong because we all felt that we could get to that center of hope. And yet, in 2016, we left so many Americans feeling that we didn't have a plan for them. The Great Recession of 2008 destroyed lives, destroyed wealth in this country. And people need hope. They need to be inspired. There's a reason why the suicide rate is up, the opioid rate is up. That's because people feel the vacuum of void. How can we fill that vacuum? How do we give them the kind of public policy and leadership that inspires hope in their lives and hope in the future? That's what the Democratic Party should do, and that's what the candidates should be focused on.
How do they do that?
Huh?
How do they do that?
Well, first of all, Donald Trump is you know, they say drain the swamp. He is the swamp. I know what the swamp looked like. I've been there. And this is crawfish season, Richard, so you know what we say in Louisiana. You know what they say about Louisiana people? We suck head and tails. It's crawfish season. He is like a crawfish. He's a bottom feeder. And we are stirring in the fear of American politics. That is what is driving our institutional support down. That is causing a crisis. I'm not saying he started it. I'm saying that he is exploiting division in ways. I had a call the other day from a newspaper and wanted to know if Democrats hate Jews. I said, oh, really? I said, do you know I was Al Gore's campaign manager? You know who our running mate was? Joe Lieberman. And you know who was the person in the room who said Joe Lieberman? This person. And you know why? Because when I was a little girl growing up in the segregated South, there was a man named Joe Lieberman who came down to Louisiana, Mississippi, and used his legal skills, used his talents to make a way for a little girl like me to one day be able to say I'm a campaign manager and the party chair twice. Golly, I got to stop getting in the line of secession, Senator Mikulski. But Joe Lieberman had those values, those kind of values that we once had as Americans. And that's why I supported Joe Lieberman. And I said to myself, so why I got to sit here and answer the question? Because Donald Trump is a bottom feeder. He feeds on negativity. He feeds on this, and he knows how to split us apart. We need to ignore him and talk directly to the American people. We need to try to break through the bubble that he has created because he sucks up all of the oxygen in the air. That's why the swamp is so bad. There's no oxygen. We need to take that oxygen back and to provide the American people the hope that they are looking for. If we do that, we'll win in 2020. And by the way, if we win in 2020, I can finally retire.
I don't believe it.
I don't believe it either. Talking about 2020 and all these different people that are running, all these different senators and Beto and other people, how do you, in your own mind, how are you in your own mind going to make the difference between these people, or how are you going to decide who you might, in your mind, back when you look at some of the people who have similar policy stances?
I think that the nominee should pitch their tent right of Sanders and Warren, but not too far to the right, because I think their diagnosis of the problems of our society is fundamentally correct. I don't think they're wrong in that. And in fact, Warren is saying a lot of interesting things about policy, with which I agree.
But I guess the question is, if there are 4 tents next to Warren and there are 4 people in that space, is it their background? Is it their identity? What is it that you think will be making the difference in your mind?
Well, I think an ability to appeal to people broadly, and hence being seen as inclusive and talking to people across a spectrum from left to center is very important. I think, Klobuchar, I think, is got a problem because he's running as a moderate, and I don't really think that that's going to work ultimately because there's too much passion and energy justifiably on the left. Well, I would say if there's door number 1, door number 2, 3, and 4 is Warren and Sanders, I'd pick door number 3.
Well, I remember back in the day when it was Gephardt, Gore, Simon, Biden, Dukakis, and then there was Jesse Jackson. Remember that? Yeah. 1988.
I do not remember that.
That's why I looked at you.
I read about it, though.
I do remember that.
Thank you. That's why she was my student. Let me just say this. This is going to be a dynamic primary season. I'm still on the Rules Committee. I'm such a geek. I love this stuff. And so you got the Iowa caucuses on February 3rd. February 11th is New Hampshire primary. Nevada caucus on the 22nd and 29th. So if you look at, we got 4 lanes in the Democratic Party. You got the populist lane, the progressive liberal lane. You got the moderate lane, which, Rick said, we got maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3, because we haven't heard from Bullock, Bennett, Sawell, Moulton, and McAuliffe, and Biden. We've got 6 candidates, 15 have announced or form exploratory committee. So we might end up with 20, 21, 22. We might go back down 18. We don't know. The bottom line is that there are enough lanes and enough candidates for 1 or possibly 3 to emerge after Super Duper Tuesday. Because on March 3rd, this is when all hell breaks loose. A year from now, we're going to know the Democratic nominee, or at least the 2 or 3 candidates who can compete for the rest of the delegates that will be up. Because on March 3rd, you have, and I had to write it down because I'm like, whoa, Alabama, California, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Vermont, and Virginia. And by the end of the week, you got Louisiana, and we're going to mess it up. So the point I'm making is that you're going to have 40% of the delegates already on the table and perhaps have already narrowed down this race to 3 or 4 candidates. So we won't have to worry for long which of the quote unquote top tier, second tier, or the asterisks that will make it to the finish line. I do believe that the ingredient that is missing is leadership, inspiring civility, and being a national leader. We keep looking at a candidate, but we have to also think about a commander-in-chief. So at some point, we're going to have to discuss foreign policy, national security as part of this dialogue that we're having in the Democratic Party. But a year from now, don't worry, we will have at least 2 or 3 viable candidates who will be in a position to win the nomination, and I do believe win the presidency on November 3rd, 2020.
Like that.
I have about 4 more minutes left of my questions, so just a reminder to please be turning in questions as you hear what these folks are saying. I want to talk about identity politics, and I want to talk about white voters. I'm going to have to combine the questions. Do you think that Democrats run the risk of talking about race too much? And should Democrats be trying to go after more white voters, especially more white independent voters?
I think it depends on how you talk about race. I think we have to talk about race. And I think identity politics actually it's BS. It's an aspersion. I mean, what was the Ku Klux Klan but identity politics? What is Donald Trump doing but white identity politics? The politics of the majority against racial minorities. So I think it would be foolish and morally wrong for the Democrats to pull punches on issues of social and racial justice. That said, there's also a broad economic context to talk about, which includes all Americans regardless of their origin and their geography. I think race also plays a role in that because we know that race affects economics. But while most Americans are white still, very few of them are rich. And the bottom 90% have suffered a lot from the fact that the top 10%, and this college scandal sort of illustrates it, is becoming its own species. So I think we can talk about race and we can talk about economics. I think we have to talk about both. But yes, do we need white voters? Damn right. It's political malpractice to ignore Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, although I note that a minority turnout in those states would help too.
Well, Donna, I was talking to Stacey Abrams. I interviewed her at South by Southwest, and she was saying, no, you shouldn't, there should be no worry about talking about race too much. What do you think?
There's no worry. I mean, at some point, people get where you're coming from, and you don't have to be explicit or implicit, but everyone understands that we cannot ignore the donkey in the room or elephant in the room, especially if you want to get Democratic primary voters. I mean, I'm not going to lecture the candidates, but if you want my vote, I want to hear these issues. I don't think talking about race offends anybody on the other side, black, white, gay, straight, Latino, Asian. Please let me know that I fit in your scheme of things and your vision of things. And and I'm a woman. I never forget in 2008, people would say, Donna, are you voting for Obama? He's black. Really? And Donna, are you supporting Hillary? She's a woman. Really? And I kept getting drawn in this conversation about whether or not I was black or female, and I'm like, okay, I'm also getting old and gray, so maybe I'll support John McCain, okay? So the point I'm making is that, yeah, we can have these conversations because they're important. People want to know where they fit. People want to know that they are being included in the agenda. And I'm going to just say something. You go to the low country in South Carolina and you're going to ignore the elephant or the donkey in the room, how many votes are you going to get? You go to Louisiana, you go to Alabama, North Carolina, Virginia, 112 to 122 electoral votes are tied to race, meaning getting people out to vote, which happens to be an inclusive electorate. So you're not going to tell me you're going to ignore this. And by the way, I'm also Irish, for those of you who can't see that in me. I'm black Irish. And by the way, as an Irish Catholic, I am altogether happy with all of my roots because I can trace my family history on one side to the Jamestown Society, the other side to the Louisiana Purchase, and I'm so happy with my roots. And trust me, I'm Irish.
Well, as people often ask me if I'm related to Lou Alcindor, I should offer that I am not related to him since that's not my roots. I'm also Haitian on both sides, so in case anybody's wondering.
Amen.
One more question for me, and then I'm going to go to audience questions. I want to ask you, looking more broadly at the idea of foreign policy. What do you make of how Democrats should be talking about foreign policy and talking about President Trump's foreign policy in particular?
Well, I think it's a fair point. That if we want to inspire the world, we have to model for the world what we're talking about. So I think we need to address our problems, and one of our problems is Donald Trump. But more broadly, it's the conditions which produce Donald Trump. Unless we're seen as a more just society, racially, socially, and economically, I think that's a foreign policy problem in itself. You know, that said, it's insane to abandon your alliances. As someone pointed out this morning, democracies generally don't attack each other. So I think we need to refortify the post-World War II global order for a new age, you know, certainly. And, you know, I think beyond that, embracing human rights. I mean, why do people want to come here? Why do people admire us when they're not angry at us for some military activity or another? It's because we stand for human rights, because we have traditionally been inclusive. And I think, you know, that's the spirit should animate our approach to the world, and it's sadly lacking.
Well, in 2008, we all recall the conversation quickly turned to whether or not a particular candidate supported the Iraqi war or didn't support the Iraqi war. I think in 2020, we are going to have another robust conversation on foreign policy, and it goes beyond just the U.S. involvement in the Middle East or Europe or Russia, our dealings with Russia, or our trade agreements and non-trade agreements with China. I think we're going to also have to talk about Africa and Latin America. We're going to have a very good, strong foreign policy conversation. It's been missing. And you know, one of the things that we see from the elections that are being held this year, and Senator Mikulski and I serve on the board of the National Democratic Institute. We just had a team of people there. James is here from the NDI. A team of people there in Nigeria. We're going to be following all of these elections across the world. 36% of the planet vote this year. And we have to pay attention. Afghanistan has an election coming up soon. So this is an area that I think Democrats are going to have a conversation about, because the future of our democracy, but the future of other democracies depend on us working with our alliances and strengthening those alliances in the future.
Mm-hmm. First question from the audience. How would you address the problem in American politics that experience and government service are devalued? How would you advise candidates to appeal to the greater public in that context?
I think actually the government shutdown helped. because people realized that how much we depend on services we take for granted and don't even think about. And the truth is that you need government to do so many fundamental things. I think there's a chance for Democrats to say, government is not, in the business of reorganizing society. It's in liberating the energies of our people. It's in helping us. It's being a partner that only it can be in certain enterprises, whether it's defending the environment or addressing housing inequities or changing the tax code or making college more affordable for more people. I mean, I think one of the big issues is that we are squandering human potential. It's not just economic potential, it's social capital. When the kids at the bottom 90% have a tough time going to school, or don't go to good schools in the first place, or don't have Head Start, whatever it is. I mean, government can help do all those things. So if you recast government as a partner and not a meddling reorganizer, as a revitalizer, then I think that's a way of talking about it.
The next question. Oh.
Every major institution in our society is now underwater with two exceptions, the military and law enforcement, and they're barely at 40 and 47%. We have a problem. I mean, the media, of course, I'm Catholic, my church, religion. We have a problem. And I think during the primary process, one of the things the Democratic candidates could do is to help educate the American people. We need to expand the electorate. We talk about the 125 or the 130 million Americans who vote in presidential election season. Well, we don't talk about the 100 million who don't vote, who don't get involved, who've lost interest in our form of government. And we need to focus on using the platform of a presidential race to educate and to try to strengthen all of these pillars of democracy. Otherwise, we face a big threat. And that threat is that people have lost interest. When you see the majority of young people looking at socialism as an economic tool to address their woes, and I'll never forget, Senator Mikulski, you're like this, 40% of young women would like to leave the country. We talk about the immigration crisis, 40% want to leave our country. So we have some big issues that I think we need to resolve during this presidential season, and why not? We got a lot of time and a lot of candidates.
Donna, this question goes to you because I know you're more familiar with kind of how the party functions. The question is, how can the Democratic Party make the primaries feel fair to avoid the sense that Sanders supporters felt in 2016 that Hillary was chosen by the party from the start? You talked about superdelegates on our call ahead of this. Talk to me a little bit about that question, but also the role that you think delegates will play this year.
Well, first of all, automatic delegates who are also unpledged delegates will not get to vote on the first ballot. I oppose that. I lost overwhelmingly. And the reason why I oppose it is because I don't believe any American should ever be denied the vote. I think the loss of the franchise is a disruptive symbol in American politics. And let me just say this for the record. In the entire time I've been a member of the Democratic Party and have worked at the Democratic, I've never been a staff person, I've been an intern, I have never seen superdelegates overturn the will of the people. It was a false argument, a perception problem that caused us to dilute the voting strength of governors, mayors, Democratic Party leaders, Democratic Party officials, activists, and donors. I have spent 30 years doing everything from voter registration to managing a presidential campaign to being serving chairs twice. I got more skin in the game than I have skin. And yet, I don't have a vote on the first ballot. What worries me about losing the vote on the first ballot is that we better get it right with the so-called pledged delegates, because I don't want to go into Milwaukee with a contested convention, and then on the second ballot, the superdelegates will have to decide the outcome of the race. So we should be part of the sauce. I agree that we should not be the main ingredient. It's like making gumbo. Everybody knows that you need a root. Otherwise, it's called a soup. And so I think that you need to make sure that superdelegates are part of the unpledged party leaders, officials, are part of the roux, but we don't have to be the main ingredient. And right now, as it stands, we will not have a role. And therefore, the pledged delegates, those that are running to support their candidate, will make the decision as to who the nominee of the party will be. That's the rules as it stands. today. And by the way, all of our meetings are open. I've been on the Democratic National Committee for almost 30 years. I have never been in a smoke-filled room, even when I used to smoke. I'm telling you, when I used to smoke. Okay. There's no smoke-filled room. They're all out in the open. And I tell my friends in the Sanders camp the same thing I told my friends in the Clinton camp. You got to earn it. You got to go out there and earn it. But just because you don't have a relationship with governors, mayors, party leaders, officials shouldn't you know, cause someone to attack us. We were attacked. We were threatened. And I did not like that as a human being, and let alone as a Democratic Party activist. I didn't like being threatened.
But the sense still, I mean, I covered the Bernie Sanders campaign.
I know
the sense
you did.
still is that this year things need to be different in terms of not only, I would say, how the Democratic Party functions, but also I would say how the media functions, if I'm being honest, in terms of how we're going to report candidates. That said, there's going to be, it sounds like 2 nights of debates. Any thoughts on kind of how the Democrats can be more fair to candidates, especially with this many running?
Look, I think the fact that, you know, in 2016 we helped all 5 candidates. Remember, we had 5 candidates. We helped everybody get on the ballot. We helped them with those candidates who could not get enough supporters to circulate their petitions. We helped them. So this notion that we were unfair, did Hillary know more Democratic governors, mayors, party officials? Absolutely. She's also had skin in the game. But the fact is that we helped every candidate get on the ballot. So I think our process is more open, more transparent. We're going to try to make the caucuses more inclusive so that if you can't get to a particular site at 7 p.m. on a cold Monday night, that you will still find a way to participate. So during the next couple of months, we're going to approve or review all of the quote-unquote various states, you know, delegate selection plans starting at the precinct level, which is why I love politics, because we go back to the precinct level. Most people don't understand that in order to win the nomination, you have to accrue delegates. In order to get on the ballot in certain states, you need people to circulate and carry your petition. In some states, it's their name that appears on the ballot, not your name. So these are all part of the rules process that I would hope that individuals, whether you're for Bernie Sanders or for Tulsi Gabbard or for Marianne Williamson or for Beto O'Rourke or Kamala Harris, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I hope that they would understand the process so that we can have a quote unquote a 2020 primary process that is devoid of all of this hyperventilation about last year or last cycle. It's going to be exciting. I can't wait.
Richard, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, as an amateur, I want to say a word on behalf of my friend Donna. Sanders lost to Clinton in the primaries by about 4 million votes. That wasn't because Debbie Wasserman Schultz was mean to him. It was, among other things, because he didn't do well among the non-white electorate, particularly in southern states, okay? So I don't think that that canard can be repeated at this point in the same way. I don't think it's going to carry the same force. And I would certainly hope not, because I thought it was BS in the first place.
We have about 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask one more question. It's kind of an audience question, but also I think a part of what I want to talk about, voter suppression and the idea that there are people all over the country who want to vote, but were either purged from rolls or were told that their signatures didn't match perfectly. What should Democrats be doing in terms of voter suppression? How should they be trying to get ahead of this? How should they be dealing with it?
Well, organizing. I mean, I think it is barely a secret that the Republicans think if we get enough rich people to give enough money and keep enough non-whites, we're going to offset the policy effects of letting people vote. You know, and that's basically been their program. So I mean, I think Democrats have to organize at the grassroots to get out their vote as best they can. I mean, Georgia's a classic example of sort of what happens when you have a voter suppression regime. So we really have to fight that. The other thing is we have to talk about it because what the GOP is doing is essentially anti-democratic. You know, it's a fundamental problem. I'm sure Donna has a lot more thoughts on that.
I can keep you here all day. But the right to vote is perhaps the most crucial aspect of our democracy. I am the first generation in my family to have full voting rights. I'm the first, a family that On my dad's side, I can trace it to 400 years. My mom's side, over 300 years. The first to have full voting rights. And in my quote unquote, my 40 years of voting, you can do the math, I'm 59. In my 40 years of voting, I have never ever seen so much corruption in our electoral process. Purging people, purging eligible citizens, requiring citizens to stand in line 4+ hours to vote, knowing that many Americans have to go to work. Telling people that they don't have an exact match. I mean, and then the hurdles that we've now put up in terms of voter registration itself, requiring some people to have an affidavit. Or if you want to register to vote in Alabama, you got to go to a certain county at a certain time when you don't have transportation.
But what should Democrats do about all this?
What Americans should do. This is an assault on American democracy, not just Democrats. We need to make this a bipartisan issue. The right to vote should never.
But it's not a bipartisan issue.
No, but we did not get a Voting Rights Act, Yamiche, with just Democratic support. We knew it took a bipartisan effort to get Democrats and Republicans to support that bill and Lyndon Johnson. I just want to emphasize bipartisan, because voting should be a nonpartisan issue. That's number one. But what Democrats have to do, we have to be vigilant. I mean, when I was chair of the party, I was shocked at the amount of money we had to spend. We, the Democratic Party, we had to spend $17, $18, $19 million to defend the right of every citizen to vote. In fact, taking some of these cases to circuit courts and federal courts because we don't have a federal right to vote. We need a federal right to vote. It's a state right now. And because it's a state right, we have 21 states that have changed their voting laws since 2014. And since 2016, we got 14 more states that are looking at changing their voting laws. You know, I was in New Hampshire. They're trying to fight now voter suppression among students. So you go to college in New Hampshire, but now they're making it harder. You have to register as a New Hampshire citizen in order to have a voting rights. And in the past, you can vote as a student. I can go down the line in terms of Nevada, the problems that they're looking to enact a voter ID. Just in the early states alone, there are changes that are being made as we speak. So I think that during the process that we will be holding on the Democratic side and evaluating all of the states who want to go early to front loading, we're going to look at their so-called voter suppression, voter intimidation tactics. And if we cannot get Democratic lawmakers to go back to their state houses and change those rules, or at least pass more progressive laws, then we're going to have a problem. I think we're going to have to be vigilant, but we're also going to have to continue to call on Congress and the administration to protect our right to vote. And that goes beyond just voting, but it also goes to election security, which I hope we get to talk about sometime today. Election security is very important. Some of these machines are as old as I am, and you know that's old. Okay? And we need to make sure that there's a paper audit, a paper trail, and the days of pregnant chads, hanging chads, and swinging chads should be over. We should improve our electoral system infrastructure in American politics.
Well, that is all the time we have. I'm from Florida, so I voted right after that election. That was the first time I was able to vote, so I learned
You're such a young kid. And she was a great student. I'm so proud of her.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate everybody coming.
Thank you so much. That concludes the morning session. For those of you coming back for the afternoon, we have an exciting program. We're going to be tackling disinformation, speaking of electoral systems. And then we'll be talking about American foreign policy. So we hope you see you back here at 2 o'clock.